The banker didn't even knock. Orson Vane shoved the gate open like he already owned it, his boots hitting the mud of Red Hollow Ranch with the weight of a man who had never once been told no. He looked at the woman standing in the yard, a widow with 2 hungry children and a battered suitcase, and he smiled. Not a kind smile. The smile of someone who has already counted the money before the deal is done. "You're wasting your time here," he said to Clara Whitmore, loud enough for her children to hear. "This ranch is mine by spring. Every nail, every fence post, every inch of dirt. And anyone fool enough to attach themselves to a sinking man deserves to go down with him." Mabel, 8 years old, pressed closer to her mother's side. Clara didn't move an inch. What Vane didn't know, what he couldn't have calculated, was that he had just made the worst mistake of his life. If this story moves you, and I believe it will, please subscribe to this channel so you never miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one's going to stay with you. The morning Clara Whitmore arrived at Red Hollow, she had exactly 43 cents in her coat pocket, 2 children who hadn't eaten a real meal since Tuesday, and the specific kind of pride that comes from being beaten down. So many times you stop letting people see you flinch. She hadn't planned to end up here. She hadn't planned up here. Nobody plans to end up standing at a stranger's gate in worn-through boots, holding a suitcase that's more leather than luggage at this point, with a 13-year-old son trying very hard to look like he isn't scared, and an 8-year-old daughter who stopped asking where they were going 2 towns back because she'd already figured out. Her mother didn't know. The death of Thomas Whitmore the previous January hadn't been dramatic. He didn't die heroically. He got a chest infection in November, tried to work through it the way stubborn men do, and was gone before the new year had any real chance to start. He left behind a wife who loved him, 2 children who needed him, a small farm outside Delwood that was mortgaged twice over, and a collection of debts that the creditors came to collect with impressive speed, given how slowly they had moved on everything else. By February, the farm was gone. By March, Clara had moved herself and the children into a single room above a laundry in town, taking in ironing and mending to cover the week's rent. She kept a list in the back of her mind of what they still had, each other, their health, a change of clothes each, and the suitcase. She did not keep a list of what they had lost, because that list would have been longer, and she couldn't afford to look at it. She spent 12 weeks asking everyone she knew if there was work. Real work? Steady work? The kind that came with shelter so she could stop spending half of everything she earned on that room above the laundry. She wasn't looking for charity. She wanted to work. She was good at it. She could cook, sew, preserve, keep accounts, manage a household, and had enough common sense to handle most problems a farm threw at you. She told people this. Some of them nodded. Most of them said they'd ask around and never mentioned it again. One woman in town, a rancher's wife named Dorothea Pell, who Clara had helped through a difficult delivery 3 years earlier, mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Gideon Mercer out at Red Hollow had been living alone since his wife passed. His place was struggling. He wasn't the easiest man in the world, she said carefully, but he wasn't cruel, just hard. He might take someone on, Dorothea said, if you frame it the right way. Clara wrote down the name. She thought about it for 2 weeks. Then she ran out of better options, borrowed a neighbor's wagon for the ride out, and went. The road to Red Hollow was longer than she expected and rougher than described. The ranch appeared through a line of bare-limbed cottonwoods. The main house sitting low against the hill, boards weathered to silver gray, one shutter hanging off its hinge. The barn needed paint. The yard needed attention. Everything about the place had the particular looks of somewhere that had been held together by one person's effort alone for too long and had finally started to slip. Clara studied all of it from the wagon seat and thought, this place is in about as much trouble as I am. Then she climbed down, took the children's hands, and walked to the gate. She knocked 3 times on the post. Gideon Mercer came out of the barn, not the house. Most of its windows were dark. He was bigger than she'd pictured, broad across the shoulders, moving with the slightly deliberate care of a man who had done physical work every day for 25 years and had the accumulated damage to show for it. He had a dark beard going gray at the edges, deep-set eyes that assessed her without warmth or hostility, and the expression of a man who had not recently had reason to be surprised by anything. He looked at her. He looked at Eli. He looked at Mabel, who was holding her mother's hand with both of hers. He looked at Mabel's shoes. They were a child's shoes that had been resoled twice already, and were coming apart at the left toe, and Mabel had stuffed a folded piece of cloth inside the front to hold them together. And it hadn't entirely worked because the cloth was visible where the seam had split. Something shifted in Gideon's expression. It wasn't pity exactly. Clara had seen pity, and she hated it. This was something quieter. Recognition, maybe. The look of someone who knows what it is to try very hard and still come up short. Mrs. Whitmore. Yes, sir, she said. Dorothea Pell sent me. She said you might need help with the house. Gideon looked at the children again, then at the suitcase, then at the sky like he was making some kind of calculation. I don't have much, he said. Neither do we, Clara said. She wasn't apologizing for it, just stating the fact. A long silence sat between them. Eli had gone very still in the way he did when he was trying not to let on that he was hungry, which he always was, which Clara always noticed even when she pretended not to. Gideon said, There's a room off the kitchen. Bit small. Your boy could take the loft in the barn if he doesn't mind the cold. He doesn't mind, Eli said immediately, before his mother could answer. Gideon looked at the boy for the first time like he was actually seeing him. Eli was 13 and tall for it, with his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and the look of a kid who had recently had to grow up faster than was fair. I'll need help with the herd, come morning, Gideon said to Eli, not asking. Testing, yes, sir, Eli said. I know cattle some. Some isn't much, no, sir, but I learn fast. Another silence. Clara waited. She had learned that the most important negotiations in her life had all been won by knowing when to stop talking. Gideon pushed the gate open. Help me with the house, he said to Clara. Your kids won't go hungry. It was not a warm welcome. It was not a particularly comfortable offer. But it was real, and Clara had spent enough time around false comfort to know the difference. She walked her children through the gate. The kitchen was a disaster. That was the only honest word for it. A single man living alone, for she would later learn 3 years had kept it functional, but not much beyond that. There were pots she'd have to scrub down to salvageable. A pantry that was organized by the logic of someone who just put things where there was space, and a wood stove that worked, but needed its flue cleaned before it would draft properly. There were mouse droppings in the corner behind the flour barrel. The window above the wash basin had a crack stuffed with rags. Clara stood in the middle of it and took stock. Mabel, to her credit, didn't complain. She said, Mama, there's a chicken in the yard. I see it, Clara said. I see that too. That's sad, Mabel said. We'll fix it, Clara said. She didn't mean just the chicken. That first evening, she cooked with what there was: salt pork, dried beans, the last of some cornmeal she found at the back of the pantry, onions going soft at the edges. It was not a fancy meal, but it was hot, and there was enough of it, and when she put it on the table, Gideon looked at it with an expression she couldn't quite read before sitting down. They ate in silence for the most part. Mabel, who had never been good at silence, asked Gideon if the horse in the barn had a name. Buck, he said. That's a good name, she said. It's just what I call him, Gideon said. Well, it's still a good name, Mabel said, with the unshakable confidence of an 8-year-old who has decided something. Gideon looked at his plate. Clara caught something at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. Not yet, but the precondition for one. After supper, after the children were settled Mabel in the room off the kitchen, Eli wrapped in 2 blankets in the barn, loft with a lantern, Clara sat at the kitchen table with the household accounts that Gideon had pulled out when she asked. She'd asked because she was practical. She needed to know what she was working with. She'd half expected him to refuse, but he dropped the ledger on the table with the weariness of a man handing over a problem he didn't know how to solve. She went through it slowly and carefully. What she found made her stomach drop. The numbers were bad. Not just struggling through a hard season bad. Bad in a way that had been building for years. Gideon was selling cattle through Briar Ridge Bank's arrangement with a buyer named Orson Vane, and the prices recorded were consistently, suspiciously low. Weight recordings that didn't match the livestock she'd seen in the yard. Payments delayed. Fees applied in ways she couldn't find the original justification for. The debt to the bank had a strange, stubborn way of barely moving despite consistent payments. Clara was not a banker, but she could read numbers, and she had lived with a farmer's accounts long enough to know what fair transactions looked like. These didn't look fair. They looked like something else entirely. She closed the ledger and sat with that for a long moment. Then she heard something. Boots on the porch. She went to the window and, in the thin moonlight, saw Gideon crossing the yard on foot, carrying something wrapped in cloth, what looked like a flour sack, heavy with contents. He walked past the barn and down the lane, away from heading in the direction of the neighbor's property to the south. He thought everyone was asleep. He was gone for nearly an hour. When he came back, the flour sack was empty. He moved quietly, like a man accustomed to not being seen, and went back into the barn. Clara stood at the window a long time after that. She had come to Red Hollow believing she was going to be the desperate one, the one who needed saving. She was beginning to understand that the situation was considerably more complicated than that. The following morning, she was up before dawn. She had the stove going, the flue cleaned enough to draft properly, and coffee, real coffee, found in a tin at the back of a shelf by the time Gideon came in from the first round of morning chores. He stopped in the kitchen doorway like the smell of it surprised him. "Sit," she said. "It's ready." He sat. She poured. He drank and said nothing for almost a full minute, and then he said, "Didn't expect coffee." "There was some," she said. "I know there was some," he said. "I just don't usually bother." "Well," Clara said, "we're going to have to start bothering." Gideon looked at her over the rim of his cup. She met his eyes without any particular expression. "Just, I'm here. I'm working. Don't make this harder than it is." He nodded once. Drank his coffee. Eli came in from the barn, smelling of hay in the cold air, with a scrape on his hand from something he hadn't mentioned and wasn't going to mention. Clara looked at it. He looked at her looking at it. She got the cloth and cleaned it without making a production of it, and he accepted this without complaint, which was its own kind of conversation between them. Gideon watched the two of them. "There's fence on the east pasture that's been down since October," he said to Eli. "I can look at it," Eli said. "It needs more than looking." "Then I can fix it," Eli said, same tone, not cocky, just steady. Gideon stood, set his cup down after cattle. "Yes, sir." It wasn't warmth. It was something more durable than warmth. It was two people deciding to work together, without yet being willing to admit why it mattered. Clara watched her son follow the rancher out of the door and felt something complicated move through her pride and grief and relief all at once in that particular ratio that only mothers in difficult circumstances know. Thomas would have liked seeing Eli step up like that. Thomas would have said something dry and affectionate about it that she would have rolled her eyes at and then thought about later. She did not let herself stay in that feeling long. There was work. She spent the morning on the kitchen reel cleaning, the kind that requires moving things and deciding what to keep and what to discard, reorganizing shelves so that what got used daily was within reach, identifying what supplies they had and what they were critically short of. She wrote a list. It was longer than the money available. She organized it by necessity and crossed off the things that could wait. By midday, she had the kitchen clean enough to cook in, properly, the water warmed for washing, and a pot of whatever she could put together from what was left in the pantry. She'd found dried apples in a sack. She was stretching them into something that was technically a pie, but really just hope in a crust. Mabel had made herself useful in the way children do when they've been raised to quietly, without being asked twice. She'd fed the single chicken, discovered there were two more she found in the old coop under boards that had fallen, and reported this as significant news. 3 chickens, she said. "That's better than 1, Clara said. "That means eggs," Mabel said. "That means eggs," Clara agreed. "Can we get more?" "Eventually." "How eventually?" "When we've earned it," Clara said. Mabel thought about this. "We're going to earn a lot of things, aren't we?" It wasn't really a question. Clara looked at her daughter, small and serious and entirely unbroken despite everything, and said, "Yes, we are." When Gideon came in at midday and saw the pie on the table longed was than anything that had come out of that kitchen in months, he stood for a moment in the doorway. "You didn't have to do all this," he said. "I said I'd help with the house," Clara said. "Sit down." He sat. That was the day she decided she wasn't going to ask him about the flour sack. Not yet. She needed to understand more before she started asking questions that might close doors. But she did something else instead. After the meal, while Gideon was back out on the property and Eli with him, Clara took the ranch ledger back out. This time she went through it line by line with a second piece of paper beside it, noting every transaction that didn't look right. Not just the numbers, the patterns, the timing of payments, the gaps. By the time the lights started going, she had 3 pages of notes and a feeling in her chest that sat somewhere between anger and dread. Orson Vane. The name appeared again and again. She didn't know him yet, but she was starting to understand what he was. That evening at supper, Mabel, because she was Mabel, and she kept her own counsel about nothing, announced that she thought Gideon should get more chickens. You said that already, Eli told her. I'm saying it again, Mabel said. Some things need saying more than once. Gideon looked at her with an expression. Clara was beginning to recognize the one that was not quite a smile, but would get there, eventually, if you gave it enough time and enough of Mabel. I'll take it under consideration, he said gravely. That means maybe, Mabel translated to her brother. I know what it means, Eli said. Good, Mabel said. Because maybe is how everything important starts. The table went quiet, not an uncomfortable quiet. The kind of quiet that settles over a room when something true has been said and everyone needs a moment to let it land. Clara reached across and straightened Mabel's collar. Gideon picked up his fork and went back to eating. But for just a second, one unguarded second, something in his face went soft in a way that Clara suspected hadn't happened in a very long time. Like a door cracking open an inch in a house where all the windows have been shut for years. Outside, the wind came off the hills and moved through the cottonwoods, rattling the bare branches together like a dry warning. Spring was fragile this year. Clara could feel it. Too cold at night, too quick to change during the day. This wasn't stable weather. This wasn't a place that intended to be easy on anyone. She looked around the kitchen, the clean shelves, the organized pantry, the stove she'd coaxed back into proper working order, the cracked window, still stuffed with rags, because that was tomorrow's problem. There was so much still to do. The accounts on the table told her the clock was already running. Orson Vane's name sat in the margins of those pages like a splinter she couldn't stop pressing with her thumb. She didn't know yet how bad it was going to get. She didn't know about the foreclosure deadline that was coming, the accusations that were coming, the blizzard that was coming, or the night she would walk into a storm to save a man who'd barely said 10 kind words to her. What she knew was this. She had come here with nothing, and a man she'd never met had opened a gate for her children. Nobody had done that in a long time. She wasn't going to let him lose everything because of it, not if she had anything left to give. And Clara Whitmore, it turned out, had considerably more than she knew. The morning after Clara organized the pantry, she found Gideon already gone from the house before first light. This was not unusual. She was learning his rhythms the way you learn the habits of a place, not because anyone tells you, but because you pay attention. He rose before dawn. He went to the cattle first. He came in for coffee, ate whatever was on the table without comment, and went back out. He didn't talk much before 8 in the morning, and even after 8, he kept most of his words close to his chest, like a man who had learned the hard way that saying things out loud made them real. What was unusual was what she found on the kitchen table when she came down. A small pouch, tied with a piece of twine. She opened it and counted 60 cents, more than she had arrived with. There was no note. Gideon Mercer was not the kind of man who wrote notes. She stood there with the coins in her palm and felt something knot up behind her sternum, not quite gratitude, not quite resentment, somewhere uncomfortably between the two. She didn't want his charity. She was here to earn her keep, and 60 cents on a table before breakfast felt dangerously close to pity, which was the one thing she had made up her mind not to accept from anyone. But she looked at the coins and thought about Mabel's shoes. She put them in her apron pocket and started the stove. Eli came in from the barn, hair standing on the left side, the way it always did when he slept hard. He sat at the table and drank the water she put in front of him without being asked and said, Gideon says the east pasture fence is worse than he thought. Worse how? Clara asked. 3 posts completely rotted through, maybe 4. The wires pulled out on the north end where the cattle pushed through last fall. He paused. He's going to need new posts. We don't have new posts. What does he have? Some timber in the back of the barn. Not cut right for posts. Can you cut it? Eli looked at her in that particular way. Teenage boys look at their mothers when they think the question is slightly insulting. Yeah, Mama, I can cut it. Then cut it, she said. After breakfast. He already asked me to. Good, she said. I'm just making sure. She flipped the salt pork in the pan and didn't say anything else. Eli ate in about 4 minutes and went back out, which was how it was going to be from now on. She had stood. Her son had found a purpose here and was going to run toward it the way he'd been running toward something ever since his father died, looking for the place where he could be useful enough to outrun the grief. She understood it. She was doing the same thing. She spent the morning wrestling the chicken coop back into something functional. This required pulling 3 boards that had rotted and replacing them with salvageable wood from a pile near the barn, persuading the wire fencing back into shape with a pair of pliers she found on a shelf that also held a broken harness collar and what appeared to be 14 years of miscellaneous screws in a coffee can. She got splinters in both palms. She hit her thumb with a hammer once and said a word. She was glad. Mabel didn't hear because Mabel was on the other side of the yard conducting what appeared to be a serious conversation with the 3 chickens about the arrangement going forward. When Gideon came around the corner of the barn and saw Clara on her knees in the dirt, reattaching wire to a fence post with bleeding hands, he stopped. "I was going to get to that," he said. "When?" she asked. A pause. "When I had time." "You don't have time," she said. "That's the problem." She pulled the wire tight, looped it twice, and sat back on her heels. "If those chickens aren't secured, something will get them. We need the eggs." "I'm not letting something get the eggs." Gideon looked at the coop. He looked at her hands. He didn't say anything about the blood. "There's rags in the barn," he said. "I'll get them when I'm done," she said. He stood there a moment longer. She thought he was going to argue, or thank her, or say something she'd have to respond to. Instead, he just went back to what he was doing. She wrapped her hands later with strips of clean cloth she found in the house, and when she sat down with the ledger that afternoon, while the children were occupied and Gideon was out with the herd, she turned to a fresh page in her own notebook and started a new column. She wrote, "What this ranch could be." Then she started listing, carefully and without sentiment, everything she'd seen in 3 days. The kitchen garden space that hadn't been planted in at least 2 seasons. The root cellar that was half empty when it should by now be holding last fall's harvest. The chickens that could be multiplying. The butter she could make if there was a milk cow, and there was, she'd seen it, a brown and white thing named something Eli had been told, but hadn't passed along yet. The eggs that could be sold at the Dunmore market, which was 8 miles by road, but less cross-country if you knew the way. She didn't write any of this to dream. She wrote it because she was calculating. The accounts on the other pages told her that Gideon's current arrangement with Orson Vane and Briar Ridge Bank was bleeding this ranch slowly and deliberately, which meant 2 things had to happen simultaneously. The bleeding had to stop, and the income had to grow from someplace Vane couldn't touch. The problem was she didn't know enough yet to move on the first part, so she focused on the second. That evening she asked Gideon, "Do you have a churn?" He looked up from his plate. "What? A butter churn? For the milk cow." "Her name's Bess," Mabel said. Apparently this had been important information all day, and nobody had asked. "Bess," Clara repeated. "Do you have a churn?" Gideon said. "There's one in the cellar. My wife used it." The sentence landed in the room and stayed there. Clara didn't flinch away from it. "Is it in working condition?" "Should be." "Good," she said. "We'll start tomorrow." Gideon's jaw tightened slightly. She noticed. She also noticed that he didn't say no. After supper, after the children were in bed, she went down to the cellar and found the churn behind a stack of empty crates. It was old but solid, the wood dry and tight, the paddle mechanism intact. She also found in the same corner a collection of her predecessor's preserving jars, still clean, and a set of molds for butter that she'd never seen the design of before, pressed with a wheat sheaf pattern that was delicate and careful, the work of a woman who had cared about small, beautiful things. Clara held one of the molds for a moment in the lamplight. She didn't know anything about Gideon's wife except that she'd died, and that the loss had done something severe to the man. The evidence of her was everywhere in this house, if you knew how to look. The good quality of the kitchen's original construction, the garden beds that still held the ghost of proper organization under 3 years of neglect, the molds with their wheat sheaf pattern, the fact that there was a good churn in the cellar and good jars on the shelf, because someone had once taken pride in this place. Clara set the mold down carefully. She was not here to replace anyone. She was here to make a home functional again, for her children's sake and for her own survival. And if that happened to help the man whose name was on the deed, then fine. She brought the churn upstairs and set it by the kitchen door. 3 days later, she had her first batch of butter. It wasn't perfect, she'd churned it slightly too long, and the texture was denser than ideal, but it was real butter from a real milk cow, and she pressed it into a mold and wrapped it and set it with the eggs she'd collected into a basket lined with cloth. She also had a small round of soft cheese she'd pressed overnight in a cloth tied to the pantry shelf, and 2 loaves of bread that had turned out better than expected, despite the flour being older than she'd have liked. She took the basket to Gideon in the yard and said, "I need to go to Dunmore." He looked at the basket. "What is that?" "Butter, she-eggs, bread, 8 miles to the market. If the prices are anything close to fair, this pays for next week's flour and salt and enough coffee that I don't have to be careful about it." Gideon stared at her, not hostile, something closer to baffled. Like a man who had been moving in one direction so long he'd genuinely stopped, considering that other directions existed. "You did all this," he started. "In the time I had," she said. "Can I use the wagon?" A pause. "I'll drive you," he said. "You have cattle." "Eli can watch cattle for 3 hours," he said, and turned back toward the barn without further discussion. Eli, when informed of this responsibility, straightened up about half an inch and said, "I got it." Mabel announced she was coming to Dunmore. "You're staying with Eli," Clara said. Mabel stayed. The drive to Dunmore took just under 2 hours each way, which meant they were sitting in a wagon together for 4 hours in a single day, which was more time than they had previously spent in the same place without work as a buffer between them. Gideon drove. Clara sat beside him with the basket on her lap and the list of supplies she needed in her coat pocket. For the first half hour, neither of them said much. Then, because she had decided to know what she needed to know, "Tell me about Orson Vane." The reins tightened slightly in Gideon's hands. She felt it more than saw it. "What about him?" Gideon said. "Not a question. A boundary. He handles your cattle sales." "Through the bank." "Yes." "Has he always weighed them himself? Or does he send someone?" A longer pause. The wagon wheel hit a rut and they both adjusted automatically. "He sends a man named Pratt," Gideon said finally. "Why are you asking about this?" "Because I've been looking at your accounts," Clara said. "And the weights recorded don't match what I've seen in your pasture." Another silence. This one had a different quality to it. "Gideon," she said, "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm telling you what I found. The numbers don't add up. The prices per head are lower than the county average I've found in the 3 newspapers on your shelf. The fees applied to your balance don't correspond to anything written in the original loan agreement that I found in the back of that ledger." He said nothing. "Do you know the full amount the bank claims you owe right now?" she asked. "More than I should," he said. "Yes," she said, "considerably more than you should. And I'd like to understand why." The road curved through a stand of bare willows, and Gideon stared at the road ahead for a long moment before he said, "You know what happens to a man around here who accuses Orson Vane of anything?" "I can imagine." "No," he said, "you probably can't." "Not yet," paused. "Vane has the bank, he has the sheriff. He has 2 councilmen in Dunmore who've been dining at his table for 15 years. Any man who goes up against him alone," he stopped. "There was a rancher named Cutler, East Valley. Good man. Started asking questions about his own accounts. 3 months later, his creditors all called their loans due on the same week. Coincidence, Vane said. He laughed once, short and humorless. Lost everything." Clara sat with this. "What happened to Cutler?" she asked. "Packed up. Left the valley. Haven't heard since." She looked at the road ahead. The willows gave way to open land, frost gray and wide, the hills dark against the pale sky. "I'm not suggesting you confront him," she said. "I'm suggesting we document everything. Clara, I'm not finished. Documenting what I've already found will take me another 2 weeks, maybe 3. I need access to whatever original receipts you have from the past 3 years. Any transaction slips, any weight tickets from the cattle sales, even if they look normal. I want copies of everything before those records can disappear." Gideon looked at her then, really looked at her, not the quick assessing glance she'd gotten at the gate, but the kind of look that takes a minute and sees more than it's comfortable with. "You think he'd take the records?" Gideon said. "I think a man who's been doing what I think he's doing doesn't leave evidence lying around when someone starts looking," Clara said, "which means we need to move carefully and we need to move soon." He turned back to the road. "You'd be putting yourself in his way," Gideon said. "He won't like it. He already doesn't like me." Clara said. He came to the gate the day after I arrived. You saw his face. I saw it. He knows I'm looking at your accounts, she said. He just doesn't know what I've found yet. Gideon's jaw worked. His hands were tight on the reins again. Why are you doing this? He said. Not suspicious, not hostile. Genuinely asking, in the tone of a man who has been given so little that he doesn't know what to do when something is offered without a catch. Clara thought about this honestly before she answered. Because you opened that gate, she said, when you had nothing, and we had less than nothing. And I'm not built the way that lets me walk away from a debt like that. He didn't say anything else for a mile or so. Then he said, the receipts are in a box under my bed. I haven't looked at them in 2 years. I'll look at them tonight, she said. They drove into Dunmore at 10:30 in the morning, the wagon wheels loud on the planked main street. Clara had Gideon drop her at the market while he saw to a supply order, and she set up her basket on the end of a table that a woman named Mrs. Fitch was apparently very territorial about, until Clara said she wasn't there to compete, just to sell what she had and be gone. Mrs. Fitch, mollified, told her the going rate for eggs and butter. It was better than Clara had hoped. She sold everything in the basket in under 40 minutes. The butter, especially a woman in a good wool coat, picked it up, turned it over to look at the wheat sheaf impression, and said, "Where is this from?" "Red Hollow Ranch," Clara said. The woman bought all 3 rounds without bargaining. Clara noted this. She noted also that 2 other women had looked at the butter and looked interested before the woman in the wool coat claimed it, which meant there was demand for more than she had. She bought flour, salt, coffee, a tin of baking powder, a length of oilcloth for the cracked window in the kitchen, and impulsively, in a way she'd seconds guess for the rest of the day, a small pair of leather shoes in what she believed was Mabel's size from a dry goods display along the wall. When Gideon came back to collect her, she was standing by the wagon with the supplies and the shoebox. He looked at the shoebox. They were selling off last season's stock, she said before he could ask. 2 cents over what I had left from the market money. He put the supplies in the back of the wagon. He didn't say anything about the shoes. On the ride back, she told him what she'd earned and what she'd spent and what was left. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "That's more than I made selling a steer last month." "From a basket of butter and eggs," Clara said. He didn't answer immediately. "I had a kitchen garden," he said finally. "Wife, she kept it going every year. Big one. Squash, beans, corn, tomatoes, preserves for the winter. Sold some in town." He paused. "After she died, I didn't. I couldn't keep up with all of it. The cattle took everything I had." "The cattle are the income," Clara said. "But they're not the only income." "No," he said, "I know. If I put in a garden this spring," she said, "we could have produce to sell by summer. The butter can be weekly if I press enough. Eggs too, once we have more chickens." She felt him, considering this. "If the foreclosure goes through before summer," he started. "It won't," she said. He looked at her. "Not if I can help it," she said, "which is what I'm trying to tell you. But I need those receipts, and I need you to stop assuming this is already over." Something moved across his face. Not easy to categorize. She'd seen that look before on men who had been fighting alone, so long they'd started making peace with losing. And the hardest thing in the world was making them understand that there was someone fighting beside them now. "The receipts are in the box," he said. "Take what you need." That night, after the children were in bed and Gideon had gone to the barn for his last round of evening checks, Clara lit the lamp and pulled the box out from under his bed with only slight hesitation about the transgression. She spread everything out on the kitchen table. It took her 3 hours. What she found in those 3 hours was systematic and deliberate and infuriating in the specific way that careful, long-running theft is infuriating, not messy or impulsive, but patient, methodical, designed by someone who knew exactly how to keep the numbers wrong in a way that was hard to catch without already knowing what you were looking for. Weight tickets altered after the fact. She could see it when she held them at an angle to the lamp, the original ink, a slightly different shade where numbers had been overwritten. Receipts with dates that didn't match the payment records in the bank ledger. Fees listed under vague designations: handling, administrative, risk allowance that corresponded to nothing in the original loan terms. She copied everything. Her hand ached from writing. She used the back of wallpaper scraps she found in the cellar because she didn't have enough proper paper, and she was not going to stop when she was in the middle of it. She was still at the table when she heard the porch creak. Gideon came back in from the barn and stopped when he saw the lamp still burning and Clara at the table also surrounded by papers. "How long have you been at that?" he said. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She showed him systematically what she'd found. Not all of it, there wasn't time, and she didn't want to overwhelm him, but the clearest examples. The weight ticket where the number had been changed. The receipt where the date was wrong. The fees that added up, over 3 years, to more than $400 she could not account for legitimately. Gideon looked at the papers. His face was very still. $400, he said. "At minimum," she said. "I may find more." He didn't say anything. "Gideon," she said carefully. "How long have you been paying off this debt?" 3 years, he said. "Since Sarah died. She managed the accounts before." After he stopped. "I just paid what they told me I owed." There it was. The gap Vane had driven through. A grieving man who'd handed over the accounting to the bank's own records because he was too exhausted by loss to audit them himself, and had trusted that what was written was what was true. Clara folded her hands on the table. "He's been taking from you," she said quietly, "since the day you stopped looking." Gideon's hand, resting on the table, closed into a loose fist. Opened again. "I worked every season," he said. "I paid every month. I kept thinking if I just worked harder." "Yes," she said. "That's what he counted on." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. She let him sit in it. She didn't rush him or soften it. He needed to feel the full shape of it before he could start figuring out what to do next. After a long time, he said, "What do we do? Not what can we do. What do we do?" She noticed the shift. "We make copies of everything important," she said. "And we find somewhere to keep them that isn't here, in case Vane decides to send someone to look around. Then, I need to talk to the other ranchers in the valley quietly, because I don't think you're the only one he's done this to. And we need to find a cattle buyer who isn't connected to Briar Ridge Bank." "There's a man out of Garvey Junction," Gideon said slowly. "Nate Pryor. Buys independent. I used him once before the loan. Fair prices. Can you contact him?" "I can ride to Garvey Junction." "When?" "End of the week. I need to get the east pasture fence finished first." "Eli can help you finish the fence," she said. He looked at her. "You trust your boy with that, don't you?" she said. A pause. "He works hard," Gideon said, "for his age. He works harder than most men twice his size." "I know," Clara said. "He doesn't complain," Gideon said. "Not once. Whatever I ask him to do, he does it." "He's been doing that since January," she said quietly. "Since his father died. Trying to be enough." She looked at her son's empty chair. "He's 13, and he's been trying to be enough for 2 years." Gideon said nothing. "Just let him help you finish the fence," she said, "and go to Garvey Junction Friday." "All right," he said. She began gathering the papers into order. He stood to go back to bed, and then stopped at the kitchen doorway. "Clara," he said. She looked up. "Those shoes," he said. "You bought them with your own money." "From the market." She waited. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Her shoes had holes in them," Clara said. "I know," he said. "I saw them the day you came." She looked at him. He was leaning in the doorway with his arms at his sides, and the expression of a man carrying something he doesn't know how to set down. "I should have," he started. Stopped. "I should have had something better here. Before you came, I let things go and I shouldn't have. You were keeping people alive in this valley," Clara said. "I saw you go out with that flour sack. The first night." He went very still. "I'm not going to tell you to stop," she said. "It's a decent thing you're doing. But you have to understand that you can't give everything away and expect this ranch to survive on its own stubbornness. You need help, and I'm here, so let me help." Gideon Mercer stood in that doorway for a moment that felt considerably longer than it was, and Clara watched something in him decide something. "All right," he said again, and this time it meant more than agreeing to a plan. She turned back to the papers. He went down the hall. Outside, an owl moved through the darkness over the cottonwoods, hunting something it could hear, but not yet see. The wind had picked up from the north, a cold current that still had winter in it, the kind that could trick you into thinking spring was further along than it was. In the barn, Eli was asleep in the loft with his boots still half on, because he'd been tired enough to stop caring. Most of its windows were dark. Mabel was curled on her side in the little room off the kitchen, her new shoes lined up carefully beside the bed, toes pointing out, the way she always set things she wanted to keep safe. Clara sat at the table in the lamplight, copying receipts in her careful, deliberate hand, page after page, The record of a man being slowly robbed by someone who had bet on him, never looking closely enough. She was looking closely, and what Orson Vane had not counted on, what he could not have predicted when he saw a widow at a gate and wrote her off in under 30 seconds, was that she was very, very good at this. She had kept her own family's accounts from the time she was 17. She had caught 2 billing errors at the mill her husband had worked with, once saving them nearly a season's profit. She could hold its windows were dark. She could hold a column of numbers in her head while doing 3 other things and tell you at the end in whether they balanced. She was not a lawyer. She was not a sheriff. She had no power in Dunmore and no name that meant anything to anyone at Briar Ridge Bank. But she had the records, and she had enough intelligence to understand that records kept carefully in multiple copies, stored safely, were the only kind of weapon that Orson Vane could not buy, threaten, or lock away in a vault. She wrote until the lamp oil ran low. Then she stopped, organized the papers into 2 identical wrapped one in the oilcloth she'd bought in Dunmore, and spent a few minutes thinking about where to put it. Not here, not the house, not the barn, somewhere else. She thought about Dorothea Pell, who had sent her here and who had a rancher's practical understanding of things. She'd ride to the Pell Ranch Sunday. She'd ask Dorothea to hold a package. She wouldn't tell her what was in it unless it became necessary. She'd just ask. Women in this valley kept each other's secrets. They always had. The men conducted their business at the bank and the courthouse. The women conducted theirs in the spaces between over kitchen tables, in quiet conversations on church steps, in favors exchanged and kept track of without anyone writing them down. Orson Vane had never paid attention to any of that. She blew out the lamp. In the dark, the ranch was quiet around her, the particular quality of quiet that belongs to places where actually sleeping ran for it rather than lying awake, pretending. The cattle were still in the east pasture. The chickens were locked in their repaired coop. The horse Gideon called Buck shifted in his stall, a sound so ordinary it was almost a comfort. Clara sat in the dark kitchen of a dying ranch, and she was not afraid. She was angry, and in her experience, anger, the clean, focused, purposeful kind that doesn't tip into hysteria or haste, was considerably more useful than fear in situations like this. She had a long way still to go. She knew that. The fence wasn't fully fixed. The accounts weren't fully documented. The foreclosure deadline was still out there like a cliff edge in the dark. There would be setbacks she couldn't foresee yet. Vane would not stay quiet when he realized what was happening. But right now, tonight, she had 2 sets of copied records and a man who had said all right like he meant it. That was enough to start. She went to bed. She slept well, which surprised her, and she didn't know it would be one of the last undisturbed nights she'd have for a long while. Gideon rode to Garvey Junction on Friday the way he said he would, which was one of the things Clara was learning about him. When he said he was going to do something, he did it, without the reminder or the follow-up that she'd grown accustomed to needing with other people. He left before sunup and was back by late afternoon, and when he came in from the barn and sat at the table, his face had a different quality to it than it had had that morning. Not quite hope, more like a man who had been expecting a door to be locked and had found it standing open. Pryor's interested, he said. Clara set the coffee in front of him. What price? Better than Vane by a significant margin. $8 a head on the mature steers. He'll come out and look at the herd in 2 weeks. 2 weeks, Clara said. That's the earliest he can come. She sat down across from him and thought about the timeline. The foreclosure deadline Gideon had told her about was late November, which was, she counted in her head, 11 weeks away. 2 weeks for Pryor to come, a few more to negotiate and complete a sale. Then the money had to move fast enough to matter. It was tight, not impossible, but tight in the way that didn't leave room for anything to go wrong. Things were already starting to go wrong. She just didn't know it yet. The next morning, she rode to Dorothea Pell's ranch on Bess, which was not ideal because Bess was a milk cow and not built for riding, and made her feelings about it known continuously for the entire 6 miles. But the wagon would have made the trip noticeable, and Clara needed to be quiet about this. She had the oilcloth-wrapped package of copied records in her saddlebag. Dorothea met her at the door with the look of a woman who had been expecting something like this eventually. "Come in," she said. "I'll put water on." They sat at Dorothea's kitchen table, which was the kind of kitchen table that had held about 40 years of difficult conversations and showed it and Clara told her as much as she needed to know. Not everything. Enough. You found proof, Dorothea said when Clara finished. Enough to show a pattern, Clara said. Maybe enough to matter in front of someone with authority, but only if it's kept somewhere Vane can't get at it. Dorothea looked at the package on the table between them. You want me to hold this in the cellar, Clarissa said. Behind whatever you normally keep in front of it. Don't tell your husband. Robert has enough to worry about, Dorothea agreed immediately, which suggested she had been managing information carefully in her own household for some time. If anything happens, Clara started. I know what to do with it, Dorothea said. I'm not a child, Clara. No, Clara said, you're not. Dorothea picked up the package and weighed it in her hands. Gideon know you're doing this? He knows about the copies. Not about bringing them here specifically. He's going to have to know everything eventually. I know, Clara said. I'm working up to it. Dorothy stood. He's a hard man to work up to. He's not as hard as he looks, Clara said. Dorothea paused and looked at her with the particular attention of someone who has just heard something more significant than the speaker intended. She didn't comment on it. She just took the package to the cellar and came back up and poured the tea. They talked for another hour about other things. Dorothea's youngest daughter, the price of grain, a family in the North Valley who'd had a bad run of illness through the fall. But at the door when Clara was leaving, Dorothea said, You know Vane came through here 2 weeks ago. Clara turned around. Asking around about Gideon, Dorothea said, about the new woman at Red Hollow, whether she had family in the county, whether anyone knew her background. She paused. I told him I barely knew you. Clara stood with this. The cold air moved between them. He's already watching, she said. He's been watching Gideon for 3 years, Dorothea said. He's been patient about it. That's what makes him dangerous. He doesn't rush. She looked at Clara steadily. You be careful. Clara rode Bess home in a different frame of mind than she'd left in. The cow's complaints about the whole enterprise seemed, if anything, reasonable under the circumstances. The week that followed was the kind of productive that papers over worry. Clara planted the kitchen garden too early, technically, but she covered the beds with cloth at night, and the risk was worth it for the head start. She expanded the butter operation, sourcing a second churn that misses. Fitch at the Dunmore market, with whom she'd achieved a careful détente, said she had in her storage shed and would loan for a share of the market proceeds. She set Mabel to collecting eggs with a seriousness that Mabel embraced fully, keeping her own count in a little notebook she'd made from folded paper, and decorated the cover of with a drawing of a chicken she described as very accurate. Eli finished the east pasture fence with Gideon, and when they came in that evening, both of them were dirty and tired in the specific companionable way of people who have done difficult work together and know it held up. Gideon told Clara the fence was solid. Eli said nothing but ate 3 helpings of dinner, which was its own kind of statement. What Clara was also doing in the spaces around everything else was finishing her documentation of the ranch accounts. She had gone through every receipt in the box under Gideon's bed, every entry in the ledger, every scrap of paper with a number on it. She had organized her findings into a document that laid out, transaction by transaction across 3 years, the difference between what Gideon should have been paid and what he was actually paid, the fees that had no legitimate origin, and the way the debt balance had been maintained at a level that kept Gideon perpetually behind despite consistent payments. The number she arrived at the amount Briar Ridge Bank and Orson Vane had taken from Gideon Mercer through fraud and manipulation was $462. In a world where a working ranch hand made $30 a month, that was more than a year's wages. That was the difference between a man who could own his future and a man who was always one bad season from losing everything. She showed Gideon the final document on a Tuesday evening. He read it slowly. He read it twice. He set it on the table and looked at the wall for a while. 462, he said. At minimum, Clara said. If there are transactions, I wasn't able to cross-reference. It's more like 500, he said. She looked at him. There were 2 sales I handled in person in the first year, he said, before everything went through the bank. Vane handled the paperwork. I never got full receipts, he paused. I thought I'd made mistakes in my own memory. I thought I was misremembering. You weren't misremembering, Clara said. His hands were flat on the table. He was the kind of man whose anger didn't show on the surface much. It went inward, dark. It went inward, and it stayed there, and it came out later in the set of his jaw, and the deliberate way he moved when he was dealing with something difficult. She could see it now, the contained quality of it. The weight of 3 years of being cheated while working himself half to death to pay a debt that had been artificially inflated from the start. What do we do with this? He said. Nothing yet, she said. Not until Pryor comes and we have a sale that doesn't go through Vane. We need money that doesn't touch Briar Ridge. Once we have that, we have more options. She hesitated. And we need the right person to show this to. Someone with authority who isn't in Vane's pocket. Sheriff Keene, Gideon said immediately, and then no. Keene's been to Vane's house for dinner 6 times in the past year. I don't trust him with this. Who do you trust? Clara asked. Gideon thought about it. There's a man named Harwell, county land assessor. He's been around for 30 years, and I've never heard anyone say a bad word about him that was worth anything. He doesn't like Vane. That's not a secret. They had a dispute over a property boundary survey 3 years back. That Harwell ruled against Vane, and Vane hasn't forgotten it. That's useful, Clara said. He might be willing to look at this, Gideon said. Unofficially at first. Can you approach him? I can write him, Gideon said. Carefully. Write him, she said. Don't put the specifics in the letter. Just ask for a meeting. He nodded. That was the Tuesday. What happened Thursday was the first sign that the situation was moving faster than Clara's careful timeline. She was in the yard checking on the garden beds 2 weeks in, and the first cautious sprouts had appeared, which was almost miraculous, and also a significant relief when she heard a horse on the road. Not an unusual thing. But this horse stopped at the gate, and the man on it was not anyone she recognized. He was young, maybe 25, with the neat clothes of someone who worked an office, and the manner of someone who'd been sent to deliver something he didn't want to deliver. He had a document in his hand. Looking for Gideon Mercer, he said. He's on the property, Clara said. She didn't open the gate. What's this about? I have a letter from Briar Ridge Bank, the young man said. For Mr. Mercer. I'll take it to him, Clarissa said. He hesitated, clearly having instructions about personal delivery. He looked at her expression, which apparently communicated something clearly, and handed the letter over the gate. She found Gideon in the south pasture and gave him the letter. He read it standing there in the cold with his coat open because he'd been working warm and hadn't stopped to close it. She watched his face. They've moved the deadline, he said. How much? 4 weeks earlier. He looked up. They want full payment by the 15th of October. That's Clara. That's 7 weeks away. She felt the ground shift slightly under everything she'd been building. 7 weeks was not 11 weeks. 7 weeks was Pryor coming and looking and negotiating and paying, all of it compressed into a window that left almost no room. He knows we're doing something, Gideon said. Yes, Clara said. How does he know? She thought about Dorothea's words. He's been watching. She thought about the fact that Vane had come to the Pell Ranch, asking about her background. She thought about the windows were dark. She thought about the Dunmore market and anyone who might have mentioned to anyone that the woman from Red Hollow was buying market space and selling off records she'd been asking about. He may not know specifically, she said. He may just be reacting to the fact that I'm here. A new person asking questions, going through the accounts. He's protecting himself. By moving the deadline. By making it harder, she said. He wants us scrambling. People who are scrambling make mistakes. Gideon folded the letter with care that was almost ironic given what it said. Put it in his coat pocket. We're not going to make it, he said. Not defeated. Just calculating we might, Clara said. Pryor is coming in 6 days, she said. If the sale goes through fast and the price holds, we can make a significant payment, enough to challenge the deadline. And if Harwell will meet with us, if, Gideon said, yes. If, she met his eyes, I need you to not decide this is over yet. He looked at her for a moment. The wind came across the pasture and moved through the dry grass. All right, he said, but she could hear in that all right that it was costing him more than the previous ones had. She went back to the house and wrote 2 letters herself that evening. One to a rancher named Caleb Shores in the North Valley, who Dorothea had mentioned in passing as someone who'd had unexplained shortfalls in his cattle accounts. One to a woman named Agnes Marbury, whose husband had lost a ranch to Briar Ridge 3 years prior and moved the family to town, where Agnes now took in laundry and had, by all accounts, a very clear memory and a considerable amount of unspent anger. She didn't know if either of them would respond. She didn't know if any of this would come together in time. What she knew was that Vane's move with the deadline meant he was worried, and a worried man who moves too fast sometimes makes visible the machinery he's been keeping hidden. She sent the letters with Eli on Friday, when he made a supply run to the feed store in town. She told him to mail them at the post office and not mention them to anyone. Eli, who had developed an accurate sense of when something serious was happening, said yes, Mama, with particular steadiness that reminded her painfully of Thomas, and also made her proud in a way that hurt. Nate Pryor arrived on the day he said he would, which put him one notch higher, in Clara's estimation, before he'd even introduced himself. He was a compact, weathered man of about 50, with direct eyes and the handshake of someone who understood that his word was his business model. He walked the herd with Gideon for 2 hours while Clara stayed at the house and tried not to count minutes. When they came back in, Pryor sat at the table and said the cattle were in decent condition given a hard winter, and he'd offer $750 a head on 32 mature steers, which he could take in 2 weeks. Gideon said 8. Pryor said $775. Gideon said deal. Clara did the arithmetic in her head before Pryor's hand was across the table. $248. Not enough to clear the debt, but enough for a substantial payment and enough to demonstrate that the ranch was producing independently of Briar Ridge's arrangement, which mattered for the argument she was building. After Pryor left, Gideon sat at the table with the handshake agreement and the number in his head and said, "It's not enough." "No," Clara said, "even with what you've been making at the market." "No," she said again, "not if we're trying to pay the full amount. But that's not the only way to fight this." He looked at her. "We're not just trying to pay a debt," she said. "We're trying to prove the debt isn't what they say it is. Those are different fights." She had written to Harwell the same night Gideon had agreed to. Gideon's letter had been careful and vague. Her follow-up, she'd sent a second letter 2 days later, which she'd told Gideon about only after the fact, which had produced a look from him that she chose to interpret as reluctant respect rather than irritation, had been considerably more specific. She had attached 3 pages of her documentation, enough to make the pattern clear, not so much that it would overwhelm or feel like an ambush. Harwell wrote back on a Saturday, 8 days after she'd sent the second letter. She recognized his handwriting from the county land records she'd looked up. For reference, careful slanted. The letters evenly spaced. The letter was short. He had reviewed what she sent. He found it concerning. He was willing to meet at his office in Dunmore on a Wednesday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and he asked that only Mr. Mercer and Mrs. Whitmore attend, and that they tell no one about the meeting. She read the letter twice. Then she went to find Gideon. He was in the barn working on a harness that had cracked at the shoulder piece. He was using an awl and a length of leather lacing and concentrating hard enough that he didn't hear her come in. Harwell wrote back, she said. He looked up. She showed him the letter. He read it. His expression didn't change much, but his hands went still. Wednesday, he said. 3 days, she said. He handed the letter back. He's willing to look at it. He said concerning, Clara said. That's not a man who's ready to dismiss it. Gideon set down the awl. He looked at the harness, the cracked shoulder piece, the work still to be done. He looked at it the way a man looks at something is just one of about 15 things that need his attention. We need to bring everything, he said. All of it. All the copies. I'll have it organized, she said. Clara. He said her name in a way that made her wait rather than turning back toward the house. If Harwell looks at this and decides it's not enough, or if Vane gets word before Wednesday. One thing at a time, she said. I know. I just want you to know I understand what you're risking. Putting yourself in front of this, she considered several responses. She said, you opened the gate. He looked at her. You keep saying I don't have to do this, she said. But you opened the gate when you had almost nothing. You put food on our table when your own pantry was bare. You've been leaving food and medicine at people's doors all winter while your own ranch was starving. So yes, I'm putting myself in front of this. Because that's what you do for people who've earned it. She paused. And because I'm angry, which helps. He almost smiled. It was brief and it disappeared quickly, but it had been there. She went back to the house and started preparing the documentation for Wednesday. What she didn't account for, what no amount of careful planning had prepared her for, was what happened the Sunday before the Wednesday meeting. She was at the garden when she heard the gate and looked up. Orson Vane walked into the yard. He hadn't sent the young office man this time. He came himself on a good horse, in a good coat, with the deliberate ease of a man who had never once in his life needed to hurry, because the world always waited for him. He was older than she'd clocked from a distance, the first time close to 60, with a broad face and pale eyes and the kind of groomed respectability that costs money to maintain and is meant to communicate that he has it. He looked at the garden. He looked at the house, at the clean windows, and the repaired shutter she'd gotten Eli to fix 2 weeks back. He looked at Clara. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, pleasantly. Mr. Vane, she said. She did not move toward him. She was holding her gardening gloves, and she did not take them off. I was hoping to speak with Mr. Mercer, he said. He's working, she said. I can wait, Vane said. He'll be a while, she said. If you'd like to leave a message, I'll pass it along. His eyes moved over the yard again in a way that was taking inventory rather than looking. He noted things she could see him noting them. The repaired coop, the new garden beds, the smoke from the chimney that meant good firewood and someone to tend it. You've made improvements, he said. The ranch needed attention, she said. Yes. He smiled. It's interesting, isn't it? A woman arrives at a struggling property with 2 children and no resources, and within a few months the whole place looks different. He paused. Makes a man wonder what else she's been doing with her time. Clara looked at him without any particular expression. She's been working, Clara said. That's generally what people do when they need to survive. Of course. He adjusted his gloves. I only mention it because I've heard, and I want to be clear that I hope it's only a rumor that someone has been making inquiries into private financial records. Bank documents, transaction records. He tilted his head. That would be a serious matter. Potentially a legal one. I imagine it would be, Clara said. If true. Quite, he held her gaze. I'd hate for something that began as a good faith arrangement to become complicated. For everyone's sake. He let that sit a moment, Mr. Mercer has always been valued by the bank. We want to see Red Hollow succeed. That's generous of you, Clara said. We're a community institution, Vane said. He looked at her one more moment, that inventory look again, assessing, calculating, and then nodded with the courtesy of a man who has made his point and knows it. Please do give Mr. Mercer my regards, he said, and tell him I look forward to discussing the October payment. I'm sure we can find an arrangement that works for everyone. He rode back out. Clara stood in the yard and listened to the hoofbeats until they were gone, and then stood there a moment longer. Her hands were steady. Her heart was going slightly faster than normal. He had come to warn her. Dressed it up with courtesy, but every word of it was a warning. He knew she'd been in the accounts. He didn't know what she'd found or what she'd done with it. He was trying to determine how much of a threat she was by watching how she reacted. She had given him nothing. But she knew now that the window was smaller than even the new deadline suggested. If Vane moved against them before Wednesday, if he found a way to get to Harwell or to discredit the documentation to mention before it could be reviewed, the whole thing collapsed. She had 3 days. She went inside and sat at the table and through the documentation one more time, not because she didn't know it by now, but because she needed to look at it with the particular eye of someone who knew it was going to be challenged. Every piece she included, she asked herself, could Vane explain this away? Could he say it was a clerical error, a misunderstood term, an honest mistake? Some of the individual items, yes. Individually, several things could be explained. The weight discrepancies alone might be attributed to human error. The delayed payments might have paperwork justification she hadn't seen. But the pattern couldn't be explained away. The pattern was what would matter. She reorganized the document to lead with the pattern before the individual examples. She added a page at the front that summarized the overall numbers in plain language, the kind of language that didn't require accounting knowledge to understand, a column that said what Gideon should have received, and a column that said what Gideon actually received, and at the bottom a number that said the difference. She wrote it clearly enough that a person reading it for the first time would understand within 2 minutes what they were looking at. Gideon came in at dusk, and she told him about Vane's visit. The set of his face changed in a way she'd come to read as the internal version of the anger that didn't show on the surface. He came himself, Gideon said. Yes. He doesn't do that, Gideon said. He sends people. I know, Clara said. He's worried. He's going to move before Wednesday, Gideon said. Maybe, she said. So we move first. She told him what she'd been thinking. They needed to get the full documentation to Harwell before Wednesday's meeting, not wait for the meeting, but send it now, along with a letter that was direct in a way the previous letters had not been, that named names and cited specific transactions and made it impossible for Harwell to set it aside or wait. If Harwell is the man you think he is, she said, he'll act on it. And if Vane goes to Harwell in the next 3 days trying to undermine us, Harwell will already know what we found. If I'm wrong about Harwell, Gideon said, then we're no worse off than we already are, Clara said. We lose the element of surprise. But Vane already suspects what we have. So the surprise is already mostly gone. Gideon sat with it. Outside, the night had gotten cold fast, the way it did sometimes in late September when the temperature dropped 12 degrees between sunset and full dark, and the sound of it was in the walls of the house a slight settling, a creak. Write the letter, he said. She wrote for 2 hours that night. She put everything in. Not the careful understatement of the first letters. This was the full account, written in her voice, signed in her own name, and she didn't minimize or hedge or use the language of someone hoping not to offend. She described what she'd found. She described what it meant. She named Orson Vane, and she named Briar Ridge Bank, and she described the systematic nature of it. She attached the full documentation. At the end, she wrote, I am aware that what I am asking you to do carries risk for you as well as for us. I am asking it anyway, because I believe you are someone who understood that the right thing and the easy thing are not always the same and chose the right thing anyway. I may be wrong about you. I don't think I am. She read it over once. She made 2 small corrections. She sealed it. At 11 o'clock at night, with the house quiet and Gideon's lamp already out, Clara Whitmore sat at the kitchen table of a dying ranch and addressed an envelope to a man she'd never met, carrying everything they had. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the farm that was gone, the life that had been dismantled around her before she had the chance to fight for it. She thought about standing in other people's kitchens, asking if there was work, and the faces of the people who had smiled kindly and said nothing. She thought about Gideon at the gate, looking at Mabel's shoes and making a decision that had nothing obvious to recommend it. She put the letter on the table where she'd remembered to give it to Eli for the morning mail. Then she heard something outside, familiar now, the soft step of Gideon crossing the yard at night. She had stopped wondering about it after she understood where he was going. But tonight the sound was different. He wasn't walking away from the house. He was standing on the porch. She waited. He didn't come in. After a minute, she went to the door and opened it. He was standing on the porch in his coat, looking out at the dark yard, the cattle invisible in the far pasture, the sky half covered with cloud. His hands were in his pockets. He turned when he heard the door. She didn't ask what he was doing. He didn't explain it. Cold tonight, he said. Yes, she said. Going to be an early winter, he said. I can feel it. How early, she said. He looked at the sky. Earlier than we want it. She stood in the doorway, the warmth of the kitchen behind her, and the cold night in front of her, and she thought, 7 weeks. The letter going out tomorrow. Prior in 2 weeks. The meeting Wednesday. Vane already moving. She thought about how much had to go right in an amount of time that kept getting smaller. We're going to be all right, she said. She wasn't sure if she was saying it to him or to herself. Gideon looked at her for a moment. I know, he said. He said it the way a man says something he wants to believe and has decided to believe, which is different from certainty, but is sometimes more durable. He went back inside. She stayed on the porch another minute, looking at the same sky he'd looked at, feeling the same cold. Then she went in and locked the door. Somewhere in the north, past the hills she could see from the kitchen window. On clear days, the season was already turning. She could feel it the same way Gideon could, not in her bones. She wasn't from here long enough for that, but in some newer, sharper instinct that she'd developed over the past weeks. The instinct of someone who had started to understand that this land was not just the backdrop to her survival, but the thing itself, and that everything she was trying to protect was connected to it. The first real frost came 4 nights later. It hit hard and fast, dropping overnight to temperatures that blackened the uncovered edges of her garden and cracked the water barrel by the barn. She lost 2 of the smaller vegetable rows. She salvaged the rest by working in the dark before dawn, with Mabel beside her, moving faster than she'd known she could move, pulling cloth covers over the beds, working by feel when the lamp wasn't enough. By the time the sun was fully up, she had saved most of it. Mabel, her breath coming in white clouds, her little hands red from the cold, looked at the covered beds and said, "We got them." "Most of them," Clara said. "The important ones," Mabel said. Clara looked at her daughter, 8 years old, standing in the frost before breakfast, having just spent an hour in the dark saving a vegetable garden, and saying, "We got them," like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Yes," Clara said. "The important ones." They went inside, and she made the coffee stronger than usual, and it was the best thing she'd tasted in a week. Harwell's response came 6 days after she sent the letter. It was not a letter this time. It was a man. He rode to Red Hollow himself on a Tuesday afternoon, unannounced alone, tied his horse at the gate, and knocked at the kitchen door with the knock of someone who has something to say and doesn't want to say it in an office. Clara let him in. He was 60 if he was a day, with the permanent squint of someone who'd spent decades outdoors, reading surveys and landmarkers, and he had her letter in his coat pocket, the expression of a man who had been losing sleep over something he'd rather not have known. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I read what you sent." "I know," she said. "Sit down." He sat. She put coffee in front of him. He didn't touch it. "I need you to understand something before we go any further," he said. "What you've documented, if it holds up, is not a small thing. This isn't a bookkeeping dispute. This is deliberate fraud carried out over multiple years. It's against multiple parties, I'd wager, and the man who did it has significant protection." "I know that," Clara said. "If we move on this and it doesn't hold," Harwell said, "Vane will come back at both of you with everything he has. He will make Gideon's situation considerably worse. And you," he looked at her directly, "you have no property here, no legal standing as a landowner. He could make your position very uncomfortable very quickly." "I know that too," she said. "And you still sent this letter?" "Yes, sir." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the coffee and drank it. "I've watched Orson Vane for 20 years, he said. "I've known something was wrong for at least 10 of them. I never had anything I could take to anyone that was clean enough to survive a challenge." He paused. "What you put together here is cleaner than anything I've seen." Clara felt something loosen slightly in her chest. "It's not perfect," she said. "Some of it will be challenged." "Some of it will," he agreed. "But the pattern holds," she said. "Yes," he said, "the pattern holds." He stayed for 2 hours. He went through everything. He asked questions that were precise and detailed, and told her he'd been waiting for exactly this kind of documentation for years, without saying so out loud. When he stood to leave, he said he needed a week to prepare, and he would not be attending Wednesday's meeting. As originally planned, the meeting needed to be postponed and reconstituted with a different purpose. He had a colleague in the county seat, a man with authority over bank practices in the territory who was not connected to Vane in any way. "I need you to trust me for 1 week," he said at the door. "Don't do anything. Don't approach Vane. Don't respond to the bank. If they send correspondence, receive it and set it aside." "1 week," Clara said. "1 week," he said, "and Mrs. Whitmore," he stopped. "What you did here, most people wouldn't have. Most people would have seen the trouble and made themselves as small as possible and waited for it to pass." "It wasn't going to pass," she said. "No," he said. "It wasn't." He picked up his hat. "You have a good eye for numbers." "My father was a careful man," she said. He nodded once and went to his horse. She stood at the door and watched him ride out, and felt the particular quality of a moment when something shifts not resolved, not over, but shifted. The scales moving, slowly, and with considerable weight still on the wrong side, but moving. She turned back to the kitchen, and there was Gideon standing at the hall doorway, having heard all of it, with an expression she didn't have a precise word for. "1 week," he said. "1 week," she said. He nodded. That was Tuesday. Wednesday passed without incident. Thursday, a letter arrived from Briar Ridge Bank, reiterating the October deadline in language that was professional and absolute. She received it and set it aside, as Harwell had said. Friday, the sky changed. She noticed it first. The way you notice things, you've been unconsciously tracking a different quality to the light. The clouds moving too fast from the northwest. The temperature dropping through the afternoon in a way that didn't level off the way it usually did toward evening. Gideon noticed it too. She saw him looking north from the pasture at a sky that was doing something wrong for October. That night she checked the garden covers twice. She told Eli to make sure Buck and Bess were secure. She made sure there was enough wood inside for 3 days. She stood at the kitchen window before bed and looked at the sky and felt what Gideon had felt on the porch 2 weeks earlier, the thing that didn't need words. Winter was not going to wait, and everything she had built, every copied receipt, every letter, every carefully preserved document, every row of frost-covered vegetable, every dollar of butter and egg money, every tentative thread of trust between herself and a man who didn't know how to let anyone in all of it was sitting under a sky that was making plans of its own. She went to bed. The storm hit before morning. She heard the wind first. It came in the early hours before dawn, not building gradually the way most storms did, but arriving all at once like something that had been held back, and then released a hard, driving wall of sound that hit the north side of the house and made the walls talk. Clara was awake before the first branch cracked outside. She lay in the dark for maybe 30 seconds, listening, and then she was up. The cold hit her when she swung her feet off the bed. Not the ordinary October cold she'd been managing for weeks. Something different. The kind of cold that has intention in it. She pulled on her heaviest clothes in the dark, moving by memory through the small room, and went to the window. She couldn't see much. The glass was already fogging from the temperature differential, and beyond it, the yard was a moving darkness. The cottonwoods bent hard and wrong-looking. The sky, the particular flat white of a blizzard, that means the clouds are loaded and have only just started letting go. It was not supposed to snow in early October. Not like this. A frost, maybe. A hard one, but not this. She went to the kitchen and built the fire up fast and high, then pulled her coat off the hook and went to Eli's room. No, the barn. She'd forgotten already, in the noise of her own waking up, that Eli slept in the barn. She went out the kitchen door, and the wind hit her like a physical argument, cold enough to make her eyes water immediately, and she crossed the yard with her head down and pulled the barn door open against the resistance of the wind and got inside. Eli was already awake. He was at Buck's stall with a lantern, checking the latch on the stall door, which was rattling in the drafts moving through the barn boards. Bess was unhappy about the noise, shifting and rolling her eyes at nothing. "You heard it," Clara said. "Hard to sleep through," Eli said. He looked at her, and she could see him calculating the same things she was: the cattle, the fence, the cold. "The east pasture fence, I know," she said. The east pasture fence that Eli and Gideon had repaired was solid now. She knew that they'd done good work on it. But solid fence did not mean much against cattle that panicked, and cattle in an early blizzard they weren't conditioned to could absolutely panic, and if they pushed through even one section and scattered into open country in this weather, they would lose animals. In a situation where every animal was load-bearing for the financial survival of this ranch, losing even 4 or 5 head would be a wound they might not recover from. She looked at her son, 13 years old, with a lantern in a barn in a blizzard at 4 in the morning. "Where's Gideon?" she said. Eli nodded toward the back of the barn. "His horse is still here." So he was in the house. Or he'd gone out on foot, which... The barn door opened and Gideon came in, already dressed for serious weather, his coat collar up and his hat pulled low. He looked at Clara and then at Eli and made the same calculations she had visibly. "East pasture," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "I'm going out," he said. He was already moving toward Buck's stall. "The cattle will be pushing against the fence on the north side. That's where the wind's coming from, and that's where they'll bunch." "I'll come," Eli said. "You'll stay," Gideon said, in a tone that was not harsh but was absolute. "I need someone here who can manage the barn if something goes wrong. Bess needs to be milked regardless, and Buck can't be the only warm-blooded thing in here making decisions." Eli's jaw set in the way that meant he disagreed, but was going to accept it because it was reasonable. "Yes, sir." "Keep the barn door latched," Gideon said. "Don't open it unless you have to." He led Buck out of the stall and saddled him with the efficiency of someone who'd done it in the dark enough times that his hands knew the way. Clara stood back and watched and thought about the fence line and the cattle and the distance from the barn to the north end of the east pasture and what the visibility was like out there. "Gideon," she said. He looked at her over Buck's back, pulling the cinch strap through. "How long?" she said. "Hour. Maybe 2. Depending on how scattered they are. If you're not back in 2 hours, I'll be back," he said. He rode out. The barn door swung shut behind him, and the wind hit it immediately from outside and held it closed like a hand pressing against the wood. Eli stood with his lantern and looked at the door for a moment. Then he turned to Bess. She's going to need more straw, he said. It's going to get colder in here before it gets better. I'll get it, Clara said. She stayed in the barn for half an hour helping Eli settle the animals, then went back to the house to check on Mabel. Her daughter was awake, sitting up in her bed with her blanket pulled up to her chin and her shoes already on her new shoes, the ones Clara had bought at the Dunmore market, but because Mabel had apparently decided in her sleep that this was the kind of situation where you kept your shoes on. Is it bad? Mabel said. It's a storm, Clara said. Nothing we can't manage. Where's Gideon? He went to check the cattle. Mabel looked toward the window where the wind was making the glass shudder in its frame. By himself? Buck is with him, Clara said. Mabel did not look entirely reassured by this. She also didn't say anything more about it, because she was 8 years old and had developed an accurate sense of when asking more questions was not going to make anyone feel better. Clara added wood to the kitchen stove and put water on. The mint. She went through the motions of mourning because the alternative was standing at the window watching nothing, which would not help anyone. She got out the flour and started biscuits. She went back to the window every few minutes. Most of its windows were dark. The light was starting to come, not the gradual brightening of a clear morning, but a slow, grudging gray that made the yard visible without making it welcoming. At some point after first light, Mabel came into the kitchen, wrapped in her blanket, and sat at the table. He's been gone a long time, Mabel said. Not yet, Clara said. Mama. She looked at her daughter. He's been gone a long time, Mabel said again, in the careful, serious voice she used when she was saying something she needed to be heard. Clara looked at the window. The snow was heavier now, moving sideways in the wind. The yard was white, and the cottonwoods were white, and the fence posts at the near edge of the property were white, and beyond them was nothing she could make out clearly. 2 hours. Gideon had said 2 hours. She counted back from when he'd left. It had been closer to 2.5. She put the biscuits in the oven. She went to the window again. Eli came in from the barn, stamping the snow off his boots, his face red from the cold. He looked at her, and she could see from his expression that he'd been tracking the same thing she had. Buck's not back, he said. He said it quietly so Mabel wouldn't hear. Mabel heard anyway. He might have had to dismount, Clara said. If the cattle were scattered, he might have had to lead some of them on foot. In this, Eli said. He knows this land, Clara said. But even as she said it, she felt the thing keeping down start to push back up the particular dread that doesn't announce itself dramatically, that just sits there, getting heavier, that is made worse by not being able to do anything. She stood at the window for another 10 minutes. The snow was not stopping. If anything, the wind had gotten worse in the last hour, and she was starting to understand viscerally what an early blizzard in open cattle country actually meant, not the inconvenience of it, which she'd dealt with before, but the scale. The way it erased landmarks. The way a man on horseback in a whiteout could be 200 yards from a building and not know which direction to go. She made a decision. Mabel, she said, come away from the window and eat something when the biscuits are done. Where are you going? Mabel said immediately. To look for him, Clara said. I'm coming, Eli said.
No, she said.
And before he could argue, I need you here with Mabel. If Gideon comes back and I'm out there, someone needs to be here to coordinate. If neither of us is here. She stopped Eli. I need you here. He was already taller than she was by half an inch, and it cost him to accept this. She could see it cost him. Take the fence line, he said. Don't go by direction, go by the fence. East pasture fence starts at the corner post by the old water trough. If you follow it north, you'll cover the whole east edge. I know, she said. She pulled on every layer she owned. She wrapped her scarf twice around her face, leaving only her eyes. She tied her coat with the extra length of rope she'd been keeping on the hall hook ever since the weather started changing. A habit from childhood that she'd never been able to explain to anyone and was now extremely grateful for. She tied one end of the rope to the porch post. Eli watched her do this. He said nothing. His face said everything. She went into the storm. The first thing that hit her was the noise. Not just loud, disorienting. Most of its windows were dark. The wind was moving the snow so that it came from every direction at once, and the sound of it was the kind of sound that makes thinking harder, that edges into the brain and crowds everything else out. She kept her head down and moved toward the old water trough by memory, counting her steps, feeling the ground through her boots. The rope played out behind her. It was 40 feet long. Most of its windows were dark. When she reached the trough and found the corner fence post, she tied the other end of the rope to those, and now she had a fixed line back to the house. Not enough to reach the full fence line, but enough to give her bearings if she got turned around. She followed the fence north. One hand on the wire, not gripping the cold metal, would pull the heat out of her bare skin through the gloves if she held too tight, just touching, keeping contact. The posts were 8 feet apart, and she counted them. 1, 2, 3. The wind was in her face now, which meant she was going north, which was correct. 7 posts. 8. She couldn't see more than about 6 feet ahead. At the 12th post, she nearly walked into Buck. The horse was standing at the fence, reins caught on the wire, which was probably the only reason he hadn't wandered. He was snowy and unhappy, and his eyes were showing white around the edges, but he was standing, alive. Clara grabbed the reins and looked around. "Gideon," she called. The wind took her voice and threw it sideways. She led Buck along the fence, one hand on the wire. The snow was deep enough, now that her boots were going into it, over the ankle, on each step, which was slowing her in a way she couldn't afford to slow. "Gideon." She heard something. Not a voice. A different quality of sound to her right, away from the fence in the open pasture. Something low and irregular. She made a choice. She dropped the fence wire, held Buck's reins, and went toward the sound. 8 feet, 10 feet, 12. He was on the ground at the base of what she realized was one of the pasture's old fence stays that had come loose and been driven by the wind, a heavy piece of wood that had struck Buck and sent the horse off sideways, and caught Gideon as he fell. He was conscious. Barely. His arm was at a wrong angle against his body, and his coat was half open, and he had been lying there long enough that the snow had begun to settle on him. Gideon. She was on her knees beside him, her hands on his face, which was cold in a way that scared her. He opened his eyes. "Clara." His voice was wrong, too slow, too careful, the voice of someone working through a thick difficulty to get words out. "Can you stand?" "Arm," he said. "Left arm. I think it's broken." "Can you stand?" A pause that was too long. "Maybe." With help, she got him sitting up first, which was not easy and not graceful. And at one point she had both arms under his and was pulling with everything she had, while he used his right arm to push and made a sound she'd never heard from him before, a sound that told her the arm was definitely broken and possibly worse. But he got upright. He swayed. She put herself under his right shoulder and took his weight. Buck was still there, reins in her left hand, Gideon's weight on her right side. "The cattle," Gideon said. "Forget the cattle," she said. "I got most of them back." "I don't care about the cattle right now," she said. "Move, Claire, move, Gideon." He moved. Getting back to the fence was harder than getting out to him had been, because now she had a man who was barely able to put one foot in front of the other, and a horse who did not like the wind in his face, and the direction they needed to go was directly into the wind. She found the fence by almost walking into the wire, grabbed it with her free hand, and followed it back south, counting posts in reverse, Gideon's weight on her shoulder getting heavier as the cold and the exertion worked on him. At the 8th post, she was panting, and her legs were going to the specific burning cold that means you've been pushing too hard in frozen conditions. At the 10th post, Gideon stumbled and she went down with him, one knee in the snow, and for a moment she wasn't sure she could get back up. She got back up. "Keep going," she said, not to him specifically, to herself, to the fence post she was holding, to the general situation. Keep going. She found her rope at the corner post, tied to where she'd left it. Hepstavit's windows were dark. She took it in her free hand and followed it back to the house, 40 feet of salvation through the whiteout. And the porch appeared out of the snow like something she'd invented, and she'd never been happier to see a porch in her life. Eli met them at the barn door, which was where she steered, because she wasn't going to get Gideon up the porch steps in his current state, and the barn was closer and warmer than the house anyway. He took Buck's reins without told, and he got himself under Gideon's other side without being asked. And the three of them got through the barn door and out of the wind. The relief of the wind stopping was so profound it was almost physical. The barn was cold, but it was 10 degrees warmer than outside, and it was not moving. It was still and enclosed and real, and Bess turned and looked at them with the mild curiosity of an animal that finds most human drama slightly inexplicable. They got Gideon down onto the hay that Eli had piled in the corner for exactly this kind of emergency, which was either foresight or an accident of tidiness. And Clara got his coat open and looked at the arm. It was broken. She'd seen broken arms before on her husband once, on a neighbor's son. This one was bad. Not breaking through the skin bad, but badly angled, and he was going to need a doctor. And until they could get a doctor, he was going to need the arm stabilized, and he was going to need warmth, because the beginnings of serious cold exposure didn't always announce themselves loudly, and sometimes they got worse before anyone realized it was happening. She sent Eli to the house for blankets, for the straightest pieces of wood she'd find in the hall closet. She knew there were some. She'd organized the hall closet 2 weeks ago, and for the strips of cloth she kept in the kitchen drawer for exactly the kind of contingency that farm life generated regularly. While Eli was gone, she knelt in the hay beside Gideon and put her hand against the side of his face and said, "Look at me." He looked at her. His eyes were present. That was what she needed to know. "Your arm is broken," she said. "We're going to splint it and get you warm, and when the storm breaks, someone is going to ride for the doctor. Not now, but soon." "The cattle," he said again. "Eli saw 3 come back to the barn on their own already," she said. This was not true. She had no idea about the cattle. But he needed to stop expending energy on the cattle. "The rest will shelter. They've been through weather before." He looked at her with the eyes of a man who knew she might be managing him and was too cold and in too much pain to fight it effectively. "You came out in that," he said. "Yes," she said. "With the rope," he said. "I saw you come out, the rope on the fence post." "Eli's idea," she said. "The fence line part." A silence. His breathing was steadier than it had been. The shivering, when it started, which it did, hard, a few minutes after they'd gotten the first blanket around him, was actually a good sign. Shivering meant the body was still fighting. It was when the shivering stopped that you worried. "I thought," he started, stopped. "Don't," she said. "I thought I wasn't going to make it back," he said, in a voice that cost him something to use. "I was lying there and I could feel the cold, and I kept thinking about the ranch, that I was going to lose it out there in a pasture. Everything I'd—" He stopped again. She didn't say anything. "And then I heard you calling," he said. She kept her hand where it was. She did not say anything reassuring or warm or crafted. She just stayed there, which was what was needed. Eli came back with blankets and the wood and the cloth and a jar of something hot. Not coffee, it's some kind of from weak broth from a beef bone she'd been saving. Had clearly done it while she was out there, had put it in the jar and wrapped the jar in a dish towel to keep it warm. 13 years old, alone in a kitchen during a blizzard, making broth for someone who wasn't even his family. She looked at her son and had to look away. They splinted the arm together. Eli held the pieces of wood in place, while Clara wrapped, and Gideon was white-faced and silent through the whole thing, except once when she had to adjust the angle, and he made a sound that she knew was all he allowed himself, the compressed expression of pain that is all a certain kind of man will admit to. When it was done, he drank the broth. He got it down in small swallows. The shivering gradually eased over the next hour as the blankets did their work, and the barn held its temperature. Mabel appeared in the barn doorway at some point, in her coat and her shoes, having apparently decided that instructions to stay in the house had an expiration point when people were in barns looking hurt. She looked at Gideon and said, "Does it hurt bad?" "Some," Gideon said. "Eli broke his finger last year," Mabel said. He cried. "I did not," Eli said. "He kind of did," Mabel told Gideon. "I did not cry," Eli said. "My eyes were watering." "Same thing," Mabel said. Gideon made a sound that took Clara a moment to identify because she hadn't heard it from him before. It was a laugh, brief and clearly painful given the broken arm, but real. Mabel, satisfied, went to say something to Bess. Clara sat back on her heels in the hay and let herself be tired for exactly 30 seconds, which was all she could afford. The storm ran through that day and into the following night, and by the morning after, it had mostly blown out, leaving behind a landscape that was completely rearranged and a cold that intended to stay. Eli rode for the doctor at first light on Buck, who was recovered and had the look of a horse prepared to behave well as a form of apology for the previous day's events. Dr. Aldred came from Dunmore in a wagon that afternoon, looked at the splint Clara had put on the arm, said it was straighter than he'd expected and that she'd done it about as well as he would have, rewrapped it with more authority, and told Gideon he would need the arm in a sling for 6 weeks minimum and could do nothing heavy with it for 3 months. "My cattle need—" Gideon started. "Your cattle need a one-armed man to point at them while other people do the work, Doctor," Aldred said, "which is going to have to do." After the doctor left, Clara sat in the kitchen with the account she'd been keeping in her head, and it was not encouraging. Gideon would be limited in what he could do physically for weeks. Pryor's cattle purchase had happened before the storm. Thankfully, the money was in Gideon's possession, real and counted, but the October deadline from the bank was in 3 days. Harwell had asked for a week, and that week was nearly up. She went to write to Harwell. She was at the table, the pen in her hand, when the sound of horses in the yurt stopped her. She went to the window. 2 horses, 2 riders. One of them she recognized immediately, Orson Vane in his good coat, his broad shoulders squared against the cold. The other was Sheriff Amos Keene, who she had met once in Dunmore, and had the general bearing of a man who does his job carefully and checks which way the wind is blowing before deciding which direction to face. They were 3 days early. She stood at the window and felt the specific quality of fury that is indistinguishable from calm. Then she went to the hall. "Gideon," she said. He appeared from the bedroom doorway, arm in the sling, moving carefully. He saw her face. "What?" "Vane is here," she said. "With Keene." A pause. 3 days early, he said. "Yes." Something passed through his expression, not fear, not defeat. Something older and harder than either of those things. He reached if its windows were dark. He reached for his coat with his right hand and got it halfway on before she moved to help him, and he accepted it, which told her how much the arm was costing him. "I'll go out," he said. "We'll go out," Clara said. "Son." "Clara, we'll go out," she said again, and went to the door. The cold hit her on the porch, sharper than it had been before the storm. Vane and Keene were still on their horses, and Vane's expression when he saw her was the kind of controlled that takes practice. He'd expected, she thought, to find Gideon incapacitated and alone. He'd expected to find a man who'd just survived a blizzard with a broken arm, not recovered enough to stand on his own porch. He hadn't expected the woman. "Mrs. Whitmore," Vane said. "Mr. Vane," she said. "Sheriff Keene." Keene nodded. He had the look of a man who wasn't entirely comfortable with the errand he'd been sent on. "I've come to discuss the outstanding debt with Mr. Mercer," Vane said. "The deadline is the 15th. "It's the 12th, Clara said. "There are preparatory matters to address," Vane said smoothly, "given the circumstances. The circumstances being that you moved the deadline forward without proper notice, and a blizzard hit the same week," Clara said. "Is that what you mean by circumstances?" Vane's jaw tightened. It was barely visible, but it was there. Gideon came out onto the porch beside her, moving carefully with the sling, and stood without speaking. Vane looked at the sling. Something moved in his pale eyes. Calculation, reassessment. He said to Gideon, "You've had a hard few days." "Some," Gideon said. "Then I won't take more of your time than necessary," Vane said. He reached into his coat and produced a document. "This is a notice of foreclosure, effective the 15th. In the event full payment is not received by Briar Ridge Bank. I wanted to deliver it personally." He held it out. Gideon didn't move. Clara stepped forward and took it. She looked at it briefly, said what he said, it said, and held it at her side. "Thank you," she said. Vane looked at her. The patience in his expression was wearing thin around the edges in a way she'd learned to track. "I want to be clear," he said, to both of them, but really to her, that this is a legal document. The full amount of the debt as recorded by Briar Ridge Bank is due by the 15th. Any partial payment, any challenge to the recorded amount will not delay the foreclosure. The amount is what it is. "The amount is what it is," Clara said. "Yes." She looked at him with her hands at her sides and the document in her right hand and an expression that gave him nothing. "Unless," Vane said, "Mr. Mercer is prepared to discuss a revised arrangement. The bank is always willing to work with borrowers who demonstrate good faith." Gideon's voice came from behind her. "No," Vane blinked. "No revised arrangement," Gideon said. "We'll be addressing the debt through other means." "Other means," Vane said. "That's what I said," Gideon said. The silence lasted about 5 seconds, and in those 5 seconds, Clara watched Orson Vane understand that something had changed, that he hadn't fully accounted for. He'd come here expecting a sick man, a frightened woman, and an open door. He'd found something else. He didn't know yet exactly what it was, but he knew enough to know the calculation was different than he'd planned for. He looked at Clara one more time. This time it wasn't the assessing look. It was something closer to the look of someone recalibrating. "The 15th, he said. "Good day, Mrs. Whitmore." He turned his horse. Keene, who had sat through the whole exchange without speaking once, gave Clara a look she couldn't quite red, before turning to follow. Not unfriendly. Something almost close to curious. She watched them ride out of the yard. When they were gone, she let out a slow breath and turned back to the porch. Gideon was leaning against the frame, his right hand gripping the wood, his face showing what the past few minutes had cost him. Physically, a pale, careful stillness that meant he was managing pain. "Get inside," she said. "Clara, inside Gideon, now." He went inside. She followed, closed the door against the cold, and stood in the hall for a moment with the foreclosure notice in her hand. 3 days. She had 3 days, and Harwell had asked for 1 week, and the week was not up. She couldn't wait for Harwell anymore. She needed to do something today, this afternoon, before Vane got back to Dunmore and started moving his own pieces. She thought about the second set of records. Dorothea's cellar. Safe. She thought about Agnes Marbury, whose husband had lost his ranch to Briar Ridge 3 years ago. Agnes had written back to Clara's letter with 2 pages of her own recollections that were not legally actionable on their own, but corroborated the pattern with a clarity that came from 3 years of angry memory. She thought about Caleb Shores, who had not written back. She thought about the county assessor and his careful hand and the sentence he'd written. "What you put together is cleaner than anything I've seen." She went to the kitchen and stood at the table and made a decision. She was not going to wait for Harwell. She was going to ride to Dunmore today, and she was going to go to his office with everything she had, and she was going to put it in front of him, in person, and she was going to tell him they had 3 days. "Eli," she called. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. She said, "It's cold," Eli said. "I know. You were just in a blizzard yesterday." "I know that too." "Saddlebuck." He went. Gideon came to the kitchen doorway and looked at her, pulling her heavy coat on again. "You're going to Dunmore," he said. "Harwell's office," she said. "I'll come." "You will not," she said. "You have a broken arm and you nearly froze to death yesterday. You'll stay here and rest and eat something, and if the cattle come back, you'll count them." "Clara." He said it the way he'd been saying it lately, not as a preamble to an argument, but with a different weight. Like her name meant something he hadn't found another word for yet. She stopped buttoning her coat and looked at him. "Be careful," he said. "I will," she said. She rode to Dunmore in the cold with the full documentation in her saddlebag and the foreclosure notice in her coat pocket and the fury she'd been carrying for weeks compressed into some very small and very hard, like a stone at the center of everything. Harwell was in his office. He looked up when she came in, and something in his expression shifted immediately. He could read the situation in her face before she said a word. "He came today," she said. 3 days early, with Keene. Harwell said something under his breath that she didn't catch. He stood up from his desk. "Sit down," he said. "I don't have time to sit," she said. "I have 3 days, and you asked for a week, and the week isn't up, but I can't give it to you anymore." "I understand," he said. "Do you?" she said. "Because I need to know right now whether you're ready to move on this, or whether I need to find someone else." Harwell looked at her for a moment, and then went to a cabinet behind his desk, opened it, and took out a document that was several pages thick, folded, and official-looking. "I wasn't waiting anymore either," he said. "This is a formal complaint filed 2 days ago with the Territorial Banking Authority through my office. I copied everything you sent me. My colleague in the county seat, his name is Whitfield. He has authority over banking practices in this territory, received his copy by express rider yesterday." Clara stood very still. 2 days ago," she said. "I told you I needed a week," Harwell said. "I had it done in 5 days. He set the document on the desk. "Whitfield is coming. He'll be in Dunmore the day after tomorrow. He wants to review the records and speak with Mercer." "That's the 14th, she said. "Yes," he said. "Vane could move on the 15th before Whitfield has the chance to." "Whitfield is bringing authority to issue a temporary hold on the foreclosure pending investigation," Harwell said. "If Vane moves before Whitfield can act, we have grounds to challenge it as an attempt to obstruct an active inquiry." Clara sat down, not because she'd decided to, because her legs made the decision without consulting her. She'd been holding herself at a particular tension for so long that the release of it, even partial, even temporary, had physical weight. "You moved before I told you to," she said. "I moved when I understood what I was looking at," Harwell said. He sat back down across from her. "Mrs. Whitmore, what you put together from those records, do you understand that it establishes a pattern across not just Gideon Mercer's account, but Based on the transaction records, I was able to cross-reference from county land filings. At least 4 other ranchers over 5 years. She looked up. 4 others, she said. That we can document currently, he said. There may be more. The kitchen table at Red Hollow weeks ago, the ledger open, the lamp low. The first time she'd understood what she was looking at. He's been doing this for years. She had known it. But knowing it in your own calculations and hearing it confirmed by someone with the authority to act on it were different things. The Cutler Ranch, she said, East Valley. Yes, Harwell said. Cutler is one of the 4. She thought about what Gideon had told her. I thought I was misremembering. I thought I'd made mistakes in my own memory. She thought about a man lying in a snowfield with a broken arm, thinking about losing the land he'd spent his whole life on. She thought about Orson Vane riding into the yard with a document designed to end someone, wearing patience like a coat. What do we do now, she said. You go back to Red Hollow, Harwell said. You tell Gideon what I've told you. You receive whatever correspondence the bank sends without it responding to it. And on the morning of the 14th, you and Mr. Mercer come to Dunmore, and you meet with Whitfield. And if Vane moves before the 14th, then he does it in full view of an active investigation, Harwell said, which is considerably different from doing it in the dark. She stood. Her legs were steadier now. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, he said. Wait until the 14th. She rode back to Red Hollow in the cold, and the cold didn't bother her the way it had going out. The sky was clear now, post-storm clear, the kind of clear that goes all the way up and has no more tricks in it. The hills stood out hard and distinct against it, and the snow on the ground caught the late afternoon light and turned it back up. She thought about Gideon in the barn, wrapped in blankets, drinking Eli's broth. She thought about Mabel telling him that Eli had cried about his finger and the sound of his laugh. She thought about the way he'd said her name on the porch, Clara, with that particular weight that had no other word for it. She thought, 2 more days, just 2 more days. When she turned into the Red Hollow lane and came through the gate, Gideon was standing on the porch. She didn't know how long he'd been standing there. Long enough to have gotten cold again, probably, which she was going to have something to say about. She got down from Buck and looked at him. Well, he said. Day after tomorrow, she said. We go to Dunmore. We meet with a man named Whitfield who has the authority to do what needs doing. She paused. Harwell filed 2 days ago, Gideon. He's been building his own case alongside ours. He was quiet for a moment. 2 days, he said. 2 days. The wind came through the cottonwoods, but it was different now, not the killer cold of the blizzard, just the ordinary cold of a late October afternoon, the kind that has no malice in it. Just weather. Just the season doing what seasons do. Gideon looked at her for a long moment, standing there in her coat, with her cheeks red from the ride and Buck's reins in her hand. And she saw in his face the complex and unguarded expression of a man who has been carrying something alone for too long and has finally been made to understand that he doesn't have to. He didn't say anything. He wasn't a man who said things easily, but he held the porch door open for her, and she walked through it, and inside the kitchen, Mabel had set the table for supper without being asked, and Eli had the stove going, and something was on the heat that smelled like the remnants of yesterday's bone broth turned to something better. Clara hung up her coat. She sat down at the table. Tomorrow, the day after, the reckoning, all of it was still out there, real and pending. Vane was still in Dunmore, calculating. The debt was still on the books. The broken arm was still in its sling. None of it was resolved. But in this kitchen, with the stove going, and her children moving around the room with the ease of people who had started to belong somewhere, and Gideon sitting down carefully across from her and accepting the coffee Mabel put in front of him without being asked in this kitchen tonight. Something had already been decided. She picked up her fork. Eat, she said to no one in particular. To all of them. They ate. The night before 14th, Clara didn't sleep much. She lay in the small room off the kitchen and listened to the house settle around her, the particular sounds of a structure that had been through a hard storm and was still adjusting. The creak of boards contracting in the cold, the occasional movement from the barn where Buck and Bess had their own opinions about the night. She'd been in this room for months now. She knew its sounds, the way you know a place when you've actually lived in it rather than just occupied it. That distinction had started to matter to her in ways she hadn't anticipated when she arrived with a battered suitcase and 43 cents. She thought about what tomorrow required. She had the documentation organized into 2 identical sets, one she would carry herself, one that would stay at Dorothea Pell's cellar until it was needed or it wasn't. She had Harwell's letter. She had her own account of Vane's visits, written down in dated entries the way she'd kept household accounts. Precise and without embellishment. She had Agnes Marbury's 2-page letter. She had the original ledger and the wait tickets and the altered receipts. What she did not have was certainty. She'd never had that. What she had was the pattern, and the pattern was real. And Harwell had looked at it with 30 years and called it the professional experience and called it the clearest thing he'd seen. That was going to have to be enough. She got up at 5. The kitchen was cold until she got the stove going, and she stood over it warming her hands and thought about all the mornings she'd stood over this stove. Since April, the slow accumulation of them, the way a day-by existence builds day-by-day existence, is something you don't notice until you look back and see how far you've come from where you started. She'd arrived in spring with 2 hungry children and a list of the problems she was trying not to look at all at once. Now it was October. The garden had produced enough to fill half the root cellar. The butter was going to market every week. Pryor's payment was in the strong box. And she was going to Dunmore today to help dismantle the thing that had been eating this ranch alive for 3 years. She was not the same woman who had stood at that gate. She wasn't sure she'd have liked this version of herself. Back then, too careful, too controlled, too many sharp edges she'd developed because the alternative was coming apart. But she understood her now. That was something. Gideon came in before 6. He was moving better than he had the day of the storm. The arm was still in its sling and would be for weeks. But the rest of him had recovered with the stubbornness of someone who simply declines to stay down. He sat at the table and she put coffee in front of him. And they went through the plan one more time, not because either of them had forgotten it, but because saying things out loud made them more real. And today was what they needed. Whitfield would be at Harwell's office at 10 o'clock. They needed to arrive by 9:30. The meeting was not a public hearing, it was a formal review. Harwell had been clear about that, but Whitfield had the territorial authority to order a hold on any foreclosure proceedings under investigation for fraudulent debt practices, and Harwell believed he would use it. "What if Vane is there?" Gideon said. "He won't be," Clara said. Harwell didn't tell him about Whitfield. "As far as Vane knows, the deadline is tomorrow and we haven't made payment. He'll find out. Someone will tell him." "Probably," she said. "But by the time he does, we'll already be in the room." Gideon drank his coffee. He was wearing a clean shirt she'd washed 2 days ago, and his good coat, which she'd noticed him take out of the wardrobe the night before without saying anything about it. The sling was clean. He'd trimmed his beard, badly, with his right hand, doing the work his left hand usually did, and there was a patch near the jaw that he'd missed, but she was not going to tell him about it. "I've been thinking," he said. She waited. "About what happens after," he said. "Assuming it goes the way we want it to. The debt gets restructured or dismissed, or whatever Whitfield decides. Pryor's money covers the legitimate balance. The ranch is clear." He paused. "What then?" She looked at him. "You came here for shelter," he said. "For work. For your kids to have a roof and food and a chance to settle somewhere." He was looking at his coffee cup. "I don't want you to think I mean the arrangement we had at the start. That's not—" He stopped, started again, which for Gideon was practically unprecedented. "This is your home too, if you want it to be. I'm not saying that because I owe you. I'm saying it because it's true." The kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at this man who had opened a gate in April when he had almost nothing, who had been secretly feeding families in the valley all winter, out of a pantry that was nearly bare, who had ridden into a blizzard to save his cattle and nearly died doing it, who had sat in a barn with a broken arm and laughed at Mabel's story about Eli's finger, who was currently sitting at a table in his good coat with a badly trimmed beard and the look of someone saying something important and knowing they were probably saying it wrong. "I know it's not because you owe me," she said. He looked up. "I stopped keeping that particular cow count a while back," she said. He held her gaze. He said, "Is that a yes?" She said, "Let's get through today first." He almost smiled. "Fair enough." They left for Dunmore at 7:30, Eli driving the wagon because Gideon's arm made the reins difficult, Clara sitting between them with the saddlebag of documents on her lap. Mabel had been left at the Pell ranch for the day Dorothea had offered without being asked. Appearing at the door the previous afternoon, as if she'd known she was needed, which was the kind of thing Dorothea did. Before they left, Mabel had hugged Clara around the waist for longer than usual, and then looked up and said, "Tell them what you found. Don't let them talk over you." "I won't," Clara said. "You never do," Mabel said, which was either a compliment or an observation, and probably both. The road to Dunmore was clear, the storm's snow had compacted and frozen, and the wagon moved well over it. They didn't talk much. There wasn't much left to say that hadn't been said, and the quiet between the three of them had long since stopped being uncomfortable. It had become its own kind of conversation. They arrived at 9:20. Harwell's office was in a two-story building on the north side of Dunmore's Main Street, the kind of office that communicated permanence and function without trying to impress anyone. The door was unlocked. Inside, Harwell was at his desk, with a man Clara had not seen before. Whitfield, she assumed immediately, because he had the same quality Harwell had of being someone who understood that his authority came from what he knew and not from how he presented himself. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 45, with the kind of eyes that cataloged things quickly and a handshake when he crossed the room to offer it that was direct without performance. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Mercer." "Mr. Whitfield," Clara said. "I've read everything Harwell sent me," Whitfield said. "I have some questions. Can we sit?" They sat. Gideon to her left, Harwell behind his desk, Whitfield across the table with a leather case open in front of him. The next hour and a half was unlike anything Clara had prepared for, which was that it was less dramatic than it should have been and more technical than she'd expected, and the most important moments were the quietest ones. Whitfield asked questions with the precision of someone who had done this before in other contexts, who understood where the gaps in documentation were and which ones mattered and which ones didn't, who asked if its windows were dark, who asked her to walk him through her methodology for identifying the altered weight tickets and listened without interrupting, and then asked 3 follow-up questions that told her he'd understood it on the first pass. He asked Gideon about the loan's original terms and how the payments had been structured and whether Gideon had ever signed anything at the bank that he hadn't had time to read fully. Gideon's answer to the last question, more than once, in the early years when Sarah was sick and I didn't have time for anything, landed in the room with weight. Whitfield wrote something in his notes. He reviewed the altered receipts himself, holding them to the window light the way Clara had done at the kitchen table in April, tilting them to catch the angle that showed the overwritten numbers. He spent a long time on the fee structures, cross-referencing them against a standard lending agreement template he'd brought with him. At 11:15, he closed his case and folded his hands on the table. "What you've documented," he said to both of them, but mostly addressing the table between them, "is consistent with a pattern I've seen in 2 other territorial jurisdictions over the past decade. It is deliberate, it is sustained, and it was designed specifically to defeat detection by anyone who wasn't looking with prior knowledge of what to look for." He paused. "Mrs. Whitmore, how long did it take you to identify the pattern?" 3 days for the first clear indication," she said. "Another 2 weeks to document it fully. With no formal accounting training, with a father who kept careful books and a husband who taught me to read a ledger," she said. Whitfield nodded once. "I'm issuing a formal hold on all foreclosure proceedings against Red Hollow Ranch, pending full investigation. The hold takes effect today and supersedes any deadline Briar Ridge Bank has communicated." He looked at Harwell. "I'll need the county land records cross-referenced against the other accounts you identified." "I'll have them by end of week," Harwell said. "The investigation will take time," Whitfield said to Gideon directly. "Months, possibly. The legal process for recovering fraudulent debt is not fast. But the hold is real and it is binding, and no one can move against this property while it is in place." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "The other ranchers," he said. "The ones Harwell found in the county records. Will they?" "They'll be contacted," Whitfield said. "Their cases will be part of the same investigation." He paused. "The Cutler family, I understand, relocated. We'll make efforts to reach them." Gideon looked at the table. He nodded. They were outside Harwell's office by noon, standing on the planked sidewalk in the October cold, and Clara stood there for a moment with the thin winter sun on her face and felt the particular quality of a moment when something that has been pressing against you for a long time lifts enough that you can take a full breath. Not over. She knew it wasn't over. Investigations took time. The legal process was slow and uncertain, and Vane would have representation and resources she couldn't match. But the hold was real. The ranch was protected. The debt was under examination. And for the first time, since she'd found that ledger on the kitchen table in April, they were not fighting in the dark. Well, Eli said from beside her. Well, she said. Yes, she said. Gideon was looking down the street. She followed his gaze. Orson Vane was standing 50 feet away, in front of the bank, with two men she didn't recognize. He had seen them come out of Harwell's office. He was looking at them with the expression of a man who has just understood something he hadn't understood before. And it was not a comfortable understanding. He didn't move toward them. She didn't move toward him. Gideon stood beside her and said nothing. It was not a triumphant moment. It wasn't clean enough for that. This was not the ending. There would be depositions and legal correspondence and months of process before anything was officially concluded. But it was the moment when Orson Vane understood that the machinery he'd been running in the dark had been dragged into the light, and the woman he'd tried to warn off a dying ranch in September was the one who'd dragged it there. He turned and went into the bank. Clara exhaled. Let's go home, she said. They picked up Mabel from Dorothea's ranch on the way back. Mabel had apparently spent the day helping Dorothea's youngest daughter with arithmetic and had opinions about how it had gone. She talked about this for most of the ride back, pausing only occasionally to ask how Dunmore had been, and when Clara said it had gone the way they'd hoped, Mabel said good, with the crisp finality of someone filing a completed matter, and returned immediately to the arithmetic discussion. Gideon from the wagon seat made a sound that Eli recognized now as his version of laughing without committing to it. They came through the Red Hollow gate at late afternoon, the sun already dropping behind, the hills, the shadows long across the snow. The ranch looked the way it always looked in this light, the gray boards, catching gold for a few minutes before the dark came. The cottonwoods, still and frost-white, the barn, solid and square and real. Clara looked at it through the gate and thought, we're still here. That was the whole of it, really. That was what mattered. Not the victory, she was too practical to call it that yet. With months of legal process still ahead, but the staying. The fact that on the other side of a blizzard and a broken arm and a foreclosure notice and everything else we're still here coming through this gate, belonging to this place. She got down from the wagon. The weeks that followed were busy in the way that had become ordinary, busy with purpose, rather than desperation, which was different in a way she couldn't have articulated before she understood it from the inside. The investigation moved in the background, Harwell sending occasional letters with updates written in his careful slanted hand. Whitfield's office contacted 3 of the 4 other affected ranchers. The 4th, a widow named Stearns, who'd sold out to the bank rather than fight, had to be tracked down in the next county over, and when she was found and told what had been uncovered, her response, delivered through Harwell, was a single sentence. I knew something was wrong, and I thought I was the only one. She was not the only one. This was the thing Clara kept coming back to. Not just the fraud, the isolation. Vane had operated for years by making each person he cheated believe they were alone in it. Believe it was their own failure, their own misunderstanding, their own bad memory. Gideon had thought he was misremembering. The Cutler man had thought he'd made mistakes. Agnes Marbury had spent 3 years wondering if her husband could have done something differently. The isolation was the method. Keep each person in their own small darkness, and they never compare notes. They never find the pattern. What Clara had done, what she hadn't even entirely planned to do when she started copying receipts on the back of wallpaper scraps, was connect the points. See the shape that each person standing alone couldn't see. She was not a lawyer. She was not a banker or a sheriff or a person of official standing in Dunmore or anywhere else. She was a widow with 2 children who had been given shelter when she needed it and had kept her eyes open, because that was the only currency she had. Sometimes that was enough. Not always. But the formal proceedings against Orson Vane began in December, when Whitfield's office submitted its findings to the territorial court. Clara was asked to provide a deposition, which she gave in Harwell's office over 3 hours on a cold Wednesday, answering questions about her methodology and her findings with the same precision she'd brought to the original documentation. The attorney from the territorial court asked her, at one point, where she had learned to read financial records as the way she did. She thought about her father sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings, walking her through his account books. She thought about 16-year-old Clara, bored and resistant at first, and then caught by the logic of it. The way numbers told the truth even when people didn't. My father believed everyone should understand where money went, she said. He said, people who don't understand their own accounts are people who can be taken advantage of. The attorney wrote something down. Orson Vane's legal representation attempted 3 times over the following months to have the documentation challenged on the grounds that it had been compiled by a person with no professional standing. Whitfield's office rejected this argument, each time with the same response. The documentation was either accurate or it wasn't, and the question of who compiled it was irrelevant to whether the numbers matched. The numbers matched. In February, Briar Ridge Bank's arrangement with Vane was suspended pending the outcome of the court process. In March, a judge in the county seat issued a formal finding of fraudulent debt practices against Orson Vane personally and Briar Ridge Bank as an institution. The fraudulent amounts applied to the affected accounts were ordered discharged. The legitimate balances the amounts actually owed under the original loan terms, stripped of the manufactured fees, and manipulated interest, were recalculated. Gideon's legitimate balance, as recalculated, was $412. Pryor's payment had been $248. Between the market money and what Clara had been setting aside from the butter and egg sales, she'd been keeping meticulous account of every cent. The habit of a woman who understood that every dollar had to be answerable. They had another $230. They paid it in full on a Tuesday morning in March in Harwell's office to a bank administrator Whitfield had appointed as interim oversight for Briar Ridge's accounts. It was not a dramatic transaction. A document was signed. A receipt was issued. Harwell witnessed it. When it was done, Gideon sat in the chair across from Harwell's desk and didn't say anything for a moment. Harwell said, "Congratulations, Mr. Mercer. You own your ranch." Gideon looked at Clara. She looked back at him. "We own it," he said. He hadn't discussed this with her beforehand. He just said it in front of Harwell, and Harwell looked between them with the expression of a man who understood considerably more than the transaction he'd just witnessed. The Cutler family, it turned out, had gone to eastern Nebraska. Harwell tracked them through a series of letters that took months. When the court's finding came down and the fraudulent amounts were discharged, the Cutlers were entitled to a return of funds that had been improperly collected. Getting those funds to them was a process that involved more correspondence than Clara liked to think about. But by late spring, a letter came back from Nebraska, written in a hand she didn't recognize, addressed to Harwell, but with a second page clearly meant for Clara and Gideon. The letter said, "We heard what you did. We heard how it happened. We want you to know that we didn't know anyone was still looking. We stopped believing anyone would look. Thank you for looking." Clara read it at the kitchen table. She folded it carefully. She put it in the back of the ledger, between the last page of accounts and the inside cover. She didn't say anything about it to anyone for a few days. Then, one evening, she told Gideon about it, and he went quiet in the way he did when something went deeper than the surface. "I want to write them back," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll help you." They wrote together, which was its own strange and comfortable thing, his words, her handwriting, both of them at the table, with the lamp between them and the winters, slowly releasing outside. He said what needed saying, which was not grand or composed, just honest. That he understood the feeling of thinking nobody was looking, that he was sorry it had taken this long, that the valley was different now, and they were welcome back if they ever chose it. The Cutlers never came back. That was their right, and nobody could fault it. But a letter came from Nebraska 6 months later saying that knowing what had happened had mattered, that it had changed the shape of the thing they'd been carrying, that some weights are lighter when you know the truth about them, even if the truth comes late. Spring arrived at Red Hollow the way spring arrives in open country, not all at once, but in increments. One warm day followed by a cold one, followed by 2 warm ones. The snow retreating from the south-facing slopes first, the ground softening in patches, the cottonwoods beginning to show the first cautious green. Clara put in the garden bigger than last year, with Mabel's help and Eli's, and Gideon walked the fence lines as his arm came out of the sling and tested itself, carefully, against real work again. He wasn't supposed to do heavy lifting for another month. He did it anyway, gradually, and Clara chose her battles, and this was not one she chose, because she understood that a man who had nearly lost his land and had been given it back needed to feel the physicality of owning it again, needed to dig a fence post and feel the resistance of the real ground under his hands. She watched him sometimes from the kitchen window, going about his work in the early light, and thought about April of the previous year, that first morning when she'd found the 60 cents on the table and stood there, angry and grateful, and unable to pick just one. The man who'd left that money and then acted like he hadn't, who had never once in months of living in close quarters under difficult circumstances allowed himself anything that looked like an easy emotion, was not entirely the same man who now stopped at the garden beds when he passed them to check how the seedlings were coming and reported his findings to Palm with a seriousness that she matched exactly. "The carrots are coming," he told Mabel one morning. "I know," Mabel said. "I checked yesterday. They're further along than yesterday." "That's what growing is," Mabel said. Gideon looked at this child with an expression Clara had stopped trying to describe to herself, because the word for it was obvious, and she was waiting for him to arrive at it on his own schedule. In May, Nate Pryor came back for a second purchase, 30 cattle this time, at $8 a head, which was the price Gideon had asked for in the first negotiation and earned through the straightforwardness of the second one. He stayed for supper and told Gideon that word had gotten around Garvey Junction and about what had happened with 3 independent buyers who'd expressed interest in establishing a direct purchasing arrangement with Red Hollow going forward, no bank intermediary, clean transactions. "You've got a reputation," Pryor said over Mabel's potato soup. "For what?" Gideon said. "For fighting back," Pryor said, "and winning." He looked at Clara. "Both of you." After Pryor left, Gideon sat on the porch in the evening while Clara washed up inside with the children. Most of its windows were dark. The light was doing the particular thing it did in May, lasting longer than you expected, holding gold over the hills until almost 8 o'clock. Most of its windows were dark, and the valley below Red Hollow spread out in it, like something you'd believe in even if nobody had painted it for you. She came out to the porch when the kitchen was done. He was in the chair he'd started occupying in the evenings, the one on the right side of the door. She'd started taking the left one. Nobody had established this arrangement formally. It had just happened, the way real arrangements do. "Eli asked me today," Gideon said, "if I'd teach him to read cattle for age." "What did you say?" she said. "Said yes," Gideon said. "Told him it'd take a season to get it right." "He'll have it in 2 months," Clara said. "Probably," Gideon agreed. The hills went darker. A barn owl moved over the pasture, low and purposeful, and Bess made a sound from inside the barn that was her general opinion about owls. "Clara," Gideon said. "Yes," she said. "I've been trying to find the right moment for this for about 3 months," he said, "and I've decided there isn't going to be a right moment, and I'm just going to say it." She waited. She'd gotten good at waiting for him. "Will you marry me?" he said. Not a question exactly. More like a statement he was asking permission for. She looked at the hills. She thought about a gate in April, and 43 cents, and a kitchen that was a disaster, and a letter that told a story nobody was meant to find. She thought about blizzards and broken arms, and rooms full of paperwork, and a man who left 60 cents on a table and pretended he hadn't. She thought about Thomas, who she had loved and lost, and who would have, she believed with everything she had, understood what was sitting on this porch with her tonight. She thought about Mabel, who had told her before bed last week, "I think Gideon is good, Mama. Not perfect good. Just actually good. Just actually good." "Yes," she said. He reached over and took her hand. His hand was the hand of someone who had worked hard every day for 25 years and intended to work hard for 25 more. It was not a soft hand. It was a real one. She held it. They married in June at Red Hollow, with Harwell and Dorothea Pell and her husband Robert in attendance, and Agnes Marbury, who had ridden out from town because Clara had asked her, and she had said yes without hesitation. Eli stood beside Gideon with the expression of a boy who was becoming something more than a boy and knew it. Mabel stood beside Clara, and at one point during the ceremony reached up and fixed a piece of Clara's hair that had come loose, without interrupting anything, just because it needed doing, and she was there. It was not a grand occasion. The food was good because Clara had made most of it. The weather was cooperative by accident rather than plan. Harwell made a short speech that was mostly about legal precedent and land rights, but had something genuine at the center of it that made Dorothea dab her eye. Gideon said his part in the way he did most important things briefly, directly, and like he meant every word. Clara said hers and looked at him while she said them. The summer that followed was the best Red Hollow had known in years, not because everything was easy, because it wasn't. The cattle needed work. The garden needed constant attention and gave it back in the terms gardens use, which is mostly their own schedule and not yours. The root cellar filled slowly with what Clara and Mabel put up, and the butter went to market every week, and Eli learned to breed cattle for age in 6 weeks rather than 2 months, which Clara had predicted and Gideon had expected, and neither of them mentioned because it would have made Eli insufferable about it. In August, a letter arrived from the territorial court with the final resolution of the Vane case. Orson Vane had been formally convicted of fraudulent banking practices. Briar Ridge Bank was placed under new oversight and stripped of several of its operating licenses. The letter was dry and official in the way legal documents always were. But Clara read it 3 times because she had earned the right to read it 3 times. She showed it to Gideon at supper. He read it once and put it down. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. Mabel, who had been following developments in the Vane case with an 8-year-old's particular interest in justice, said, "Does that mean he goes to jail?" For a while, Clara said. "Good," Mabel said, and went back to her food. Eli said nothing. He'd been saying less generally since he turned 14, growing into a different kind of quiet than his childhood silence, a thinking quiet rather than a afraid quiet. He looked at the letter on the table, and then at his mother, and there was something in his face that was too complicated for the words a 14-year-old has access to, so he just nodded, which was its own complete sentence. That evening, after the children were in bed, Clara went out to the garden, not to work, just to stand in it. The summer plants were at their height, the tomatoes heavy on their stakes, the beans full and dark, the squash spreading its big leaves across the ground, with the confidence of something that knows it belongs there. The smell of it in the evening was specific and real earth and green and the particular warmth that soil holds after a summer day. She had grown this from bare ground. She had grown most of what was around her from bare ground, one way or another. The kitchen that had been a disaster, the coop that had held 3 chickens, the accounts that had been a record of theft dressed as legitimate debt, the trust of a man who didn't trust easily and had more reasons than most not to, the home that had been a dying house when she walked into it with her children and her 43 cents. She was not going to stand here and tell herself she'd done it alone. She hadn't. She'd had Dorothea and Harwell and Agnes Marbury and Nate Pryor and Eli's steady hands and Mabel's clear eyes and Gideon's stubborn, generous, slowly opening heart. She'd had the families Gideon had been feeding all winter who came back in spring and helped rebuild what the storm damaged, quietly, without being asked. Because that's what people do when someone has shown them what doing right looks like. You couldn't do it alone. That was the lesson that she kept arriving at. Not the lesson that people were good, some weren't. And Vane had been the proof of that, the elaborate proof of what patient malice looked like, dressed in community standing. But the lessons that isolation was the enemy. That the thing predators counted on most was people not comparing notes. Not reaching across the fence line to say, "Does your number look wrong to you too? Because mine looks wrong." She had reached across. She was not a hero in any story she'd tell about this. She was a woman who needed to survive. In the process of surviving, had looked closely at something most people had learned to look away from, and had refused to look away, and had kept copies of everything, and had written letters when letters were what was needed, and ridden into blizzards when that was what was needed, and sat at kitchen tables doing arithmetic at midnight when that was what the situation called for. That was all. That was enough. Enough had turned out to be enough. She heard the gate and turned. Gideon was coming across the yard. He'd come from the barn, his last check of the evening, the same route he walked every night, because the animals needed it. And because some habits are worth keeping. He saw her standing in the garden and stopped. "Couldn't sleep?" he said. "Didn't try yet," she said. He came to the garden gate and leaned on it, looking at what she'd grown. He looked at it the way he'd started looking at this place in the past months, not with the desperate accounting of a man calculating what he might lose, but with the quieter attention of someone who has started to believe in what he has. I was thinking about the Cutlers, he said. I was thinking about them too, she said. Do you think they'll ever come back? No, she said. I don't think you can come back from something like that. When you've had to leave and build something somewhere else, it's not the same place anymore, even if you go back. He nodded. He understood that. But they know, she said. That's different from not knowing. That's worth something. Is it enough? She thought about this honestly. No, she said. Probably not. But it's what we could give them. She paused. We can't give people back what was taken. We can only make sure it's named. Make sure it's known. Make sure it doesn't keep happening. He was quiet for a moment. Red Hollow's going to be all right, he said. Not a question. A statement of something he was choosing to hold on to. Yes, she said, it is. He pushed the garden gate open. She walked out of the garden, and he pulled the gate closed behind her and latched it. The small, careful habit of a man who has learned that the things worth keeping need tending. They walked back to the house side by side. The cottonwoods moved in the light evening wind. The barn was quiet. The valley below lay in the blue, summer dark. The hills steady at its edges, a few lights from distant farms flickering in the low places where other people were living their own lives with their own troubles and their own small victories. Clara had arrived at this gate with nothing she could count. She had arrived at the end of her rope and found that the end of your rope is sometimes just the beginning of the next thing. If you're willing to hold on long enough and look clearly enough at what's actually in front of you. She didn't believe in easy endings. She never had. What she believed in was this, that most people, given the chance to choose between turning away and staying, would stay. That most people, when someone reached across the fence line and said, I think something's wrong here, does it look wrong to you too, would answer honestly. That the world was not mostly Orson Vane's, that it was mostly Dorothea Pells and Harwells and Agnes Marburys and Nate Pryors and boys who made broth in a blizzard because someone needed it. She believed this not because it was comfortable, but because she had seen it be true, repeatedly in the months behind her. At the porch steps, Gideon held the door. She went inside. The kitchen was warm. The lamp on the table was low and even. Somewhere down the hall, Mabel was asleep, with her shoes lined up beside the bed, toes pointing out. Eli was in the barn loft, probably still reading by lantern, probably with his boots still half on. Clara stood in the kitchen of the home she had helped save and looked around at what ordinary evenings were made of the clean dishes. The gardenful root cellar, the account book with its honest numbers, the letter from the Cutlers in the back of the ledger. Gideon came in behind her and closed the door against the night. She blew out the lamp. They had a morning coming. They had a whole string of mornings coming, each one with its own demands and its own small satisfactions, the cattle that needed checking, and the garden that needed watching, and the accounts that needed keeping, and the butter that needed churning, and the that would always, somewhere, need attention, because fences always did. That was not a burden, that was a life, and it was theirs.